The 70-story tower was going to fall. Not today, not tomorrow. But in 15 years, maybe 20, when the steel joints fatigued and the redundancy systems that should have existed never did, Summit Arc Tower would become the deadliest engineering failure in modern history. Daniel Hayes stood in the empty conference room at midnight, structural calculations spread across the table like an autopsy report, and realized he was the only person who knew. He was a single father with a 12-year-old daughter who needed stability, health insurance, and a father who came home every night. He was 43 years old and had spent 2 decades perfecting the art of being invisible, the quiet engineer who made buildings stand while louder men collected the credit. He had every reason to stay silent, and one reason to speak. He couldn't live with himself if he didn't. Before we dive into this story of courage, integrity, and the cost of doing what's right, I want to invite you to stay with me until the very end. If this story resonates with you, please hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel and connecting with all of you around the world. Now, let's begin. The fluorescent lights in the Titan Ridge development offices hummed with the particular frequency of late-night ambition. Most of the building had gone dark hours ago, the junior architects and project managers retreating to their lives beyond the glass and steel fortress that dominated the downtown skyline. But on the 42nd floor, in a corner office that overlooked the construction site of what would become the city's tallest residential tower, Daniel Hayes sat alone with a problem that wouldn't let him sleep. The Summit Arc Tower. 70 stories of luxury condominiums, retail space, and what the marketing materials called vertical living redefined. Daniel had been part of the structural engineering team since the initial concept phase 3 years ago. He'd watched the design evolve from ambitious to extraordinary to, in recent months, terrifying. He rubbed his eyes, the blue light from his computer screen making them burn. The digital clock in the corner read 11:47 p.m. Lily would be asleep by now, safe at home with Mrs. Patterson, the retired teacher who lived next door and had become Daniel's lifeline since his wife passed away 6 years ago. 12-year-old girls needed more than a father who worked late, but Daniel had convinced himself that stability, the kind that came from a steady paycheck and good health insurance, was a form of love, too. The spreadsheet on his screen told a different story about love. It told a story about corners cut and safety margins reduced and redundancy systems eliminated in the name of budget optimization. The numbers were technically legal. They met code. But Daniel had been an engineer long enough to know that meeting minimum requirements and building something that would actually protect lives were not always the same thing. "Still here, Hayes?" Daniel looked up to find Grant Mercer standing in the doorway, suit jacket draped over one arm, tie loosened but not removed. Grant was a partner at Titan Ridge, 10 years younger than Daniel, and already positioned to make VP before he turned 40. He had the kind of confidence that came from never having been seriously wrong about anything, or at least never having been held accountable for it. "Just reviewing the latest revisions," Daniel said, minimizing the screen reflexively. The gesture was automatic. 20 years of being the quiet guy who didn't make waves. Grant walked into the office without invitation, the way he entered every room. "The structural modifications for Summit Arc? Those are locked. We presented to the board 3 weeks ago." "I know. I was there." "Then what's to review?" Grant's tone was light, but Daniel heard the edge underneath. Grant didn't like questions, especially from people who were supposed to execute rather than evaluate. Daniel hesitated. This was the moment. He could close the laptop, make some excuse about double-checking calculations for his own peace of mind, and go home to Lily. Or he could do what every instinct in his careful, calculated life told him not to do. "The load distribution on the vertical support columns," Daniel said quietly. "We eliminated the secondary reinforcement system to save on steel costs. And the cross-bracing intervals were increased by 40%. All approved by the structural team. All within code specifications." "Within minimum specifications," Daniel corrected. "For a building this height, in a seismic zone, with the wind load factors we're dealing with." "We have 3 independent engineering consultants who signed off on this design," Grant interrupted. "We have city permits. We have investor commitments based on a budget that works, because we made smart optimization decisions. What we don't have is time for second-guessing from someone who wasn't even in the room when these calls were made." The words landed exactly where Grant intended. Daniel hadn't been in the room. He never was when the big decisions happened. He was the guy who made sure the decisions could be implemented, who turned concepts into calculations, who solved problems quietly so that people like Grant could present solutions loudly. "I understand the commercial pressure," Daniel said, keeping his voice even. "But if we're wrong about the long-term structural integrity, we're not wrong. And even if there were concerns, which there aren't, the building will be inspected at every phase. If something needs adjustment, we'll catch it." Grant picked up one of the architectural renderings from Daniel's desk, the glossy image showing Summit Arc Tower gleaming against a sunset sky, impossibly elegant and impossibly tall. "This project defines the next decade for Titan Ridge. It's already generating contracts for 3 more towers in the metro area. The mayor's office is calling it transformational urban development. Do you know what it would do to this firm if we started spreading doubt about our flagship project?" "I'm not trying to spread doubt. I'm trying to prevent a structural failure." "Based on what? Your gut feeling?" Grant set the rendering down with enough force to make it a statement. "Hayes, I know you're thorough. It's why you're valuable. But there's a difference between thoroughness and paranoia. Trust the process. Trust the team. Trust that people who've been doing this longer than both of us combined know what they're doing." Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. Not anger. He'd learned long ago that anger was a luxury people like him couldn't afford. But something else. Something that felt like the last conversation he'd had with his wife before she died, when she'd made him promise that he'd never teach Lily to make herself smaller to make other people comfortable. "I'd like to present my concerns to Victoria," Daniel said. Grant's expression shifted, the professional courtesy falling away to reveal something colder underneath. "Victoria Cole has 20 projects on her desk and a board meeting in 72 hours. She doesn't have time for theoretical anxieties from a mid-level engineer who's suddenly decided to play structural prophet." "Then I'll schedule time through proper channels." "You do that," Grant said, already moving toward the door. He paused at the threshold, looking back with something that might have been sympathy or might have been pity. "Word of advice, Hayes? Pick your battles. You've got a daughter to think about. Job security matters. Being right doesn't always matter more than being employed." The office felt colder after Grant left. Daniel sat in the silence, staring at the numbers on his screen that told a story about a building that would stand for years before it failed. Long enough that the original engineers would have moved on. Long enough that accountability would be diffused across dozens of decision-makers and contractors and consultants. Long enough that when it finally came down, people would call it a tragedy instead of a crime. He thought about Lily, who had his wife's eyes and her uncompromising sense of right and wrong, who came home from school last week upset because her science teacher had marked her correct answer wrong and refused to admit the mistake, who had looked at Daniel with desperate hope and asked, "What do I do when I know I'm right but everyone else says I'm wrong?" He told her to stand firm, to be respectful but clear, to trust that the truth mattered even when it was inconvenient. Now he had to decide if he believed his own advice. Daniel pulled up his email and began typing. "Ma'am." The next morning arrived with the particular brightness of autumn in the city, the kind of light that made glass buildings look like monuments to human ambition. Daniel dropped Lily off at school, watching her disappear into the crowd of 12-year-olds with her backpack and her stubborn conviction that middle school was a system designed to crush individuality. "Dad," she'd said as she unbuckled her seatbelt, "can I ask you something?" "Always. If you know something bad is going to happen, but you can't prove it yet, and everyone tells you you're wrong, do you still have to say something?" Daniel had looked at his daughter, this fierce little person who was becoming more like her mother every day, and felt the weight of every compromise he'd ever made to keep life stable. "Yes," he said. "You say something, even if it's hard. Even if people get mad?" "Even then." She'd nodded, satisfied, and walked into school with her shoulders back. Daniel had driven to work wondering if he was about to lose everything for following the advice he'd just given his daughter. The email he'd sent to Victoria Cole at 1:23 a.m. had been direct but professional. He'd outlined his concerns about the structural modifications, attached his calculations, and requested a meeting to discuss potential solutions before construction progressed beyond the point of practical revision. He'd copied no one. This wasn't about politics or positioning, it was about a building that needed to be safe. He'd expected a response from Victoria's assistant, maybe a calendar invitation for sometime next week. What he got instead, at 9:15 a.m., was a message from Victoria herself. My office. 10 a.m. Come prepared to defend your analysis. Daniel gathered his materials, printed calculations, digital models, reference specifications from similar high-rise projects, and tried to ignore the looks from colleagues who'd clearly already heard about his late-night email. In an office where information traveled faster than light, questioning a major project was basically declaring war. Victoria Cole's office occupied the northeast corner of the 44th floor, with windows that offered an unobstructed view of the construction site and the city beyond. She'd been managing partner at Titan Ridge for 4 years, brought in from a competing firm with a reputation for brilliant design and ruthless project management. She was 46, unmarried, and known for arriving before everyone else and leaving after everyone else, maintaining control through sheer force of preparation. Daniel had worked on 3 projects under her leadership and had spoken to her directly, maybe a dozen times. She was fair but distant, the kind of leader who valued results over relationships. He had no idea how she would respond to an engineer challenging a project she'd already approved. Her assistant waved him through at exactly 10 a.m. Victoria stood at her desk, studying what looked like the same structural drawings Daniel had been analyzing the night before. She didn't look up when he entered. "Close the door," she said. Daniel did. "Sit." He sat. Victoria finally looked at him, her expression unreadable. She was dressed in the same sharp, minimalist style she always wore. Dark suit, minimal jewelry, hair pulled back in a way that suggested efficiency rather than fashion. Her eyes were intelligent and tired, the eyes of someone who'd built a career on being the smartest person in every room and paying the price for it. "I've read your email 3 times, she said. "I've reviewed your calculations. I've cross-referenced them against our approved specifications and the consultant reports we paid 6 figures for. Do you know what I found?" Daniel's stomach tightened. "What did you find?" "That you're right." The words hung in the air between them, more shocking than any accusation would have been. Victoria walked to the window, looking down at the construction site where Summit Arc Tower was already rising from the ground, steel skeleton reaching toward sky. "The secondary reinforcement system we cut, it wasn't just redundancy, it was insurance against long-term material fatigue. The cross-bracing intervals we extended, they save money now, but increase stress concentration at critical joints. Everything meets code because code is written for average conditions and acceptable risk. But this isn't an average building, and I don't accept the risk." She turned back to Daniel. "Why did you send this to me instead of Grant?" "I spoke to Grant last night. He told me to trust the process." Grant Mercer is an excellent project manager and a terrible engineer. He thinks risk management means choosing the most expensive insurance policy, not actually understanding what you're insuring against. Victoria returned to her desk, sitting down with the kind of controlled movement that suggested chronic back pain or chronic stress or both. "Do you know what will happen if we redesign the structural system at this stage? Cost overrun, schedule delays, investor concerns." "Investor revolt," Victoria corrected. "We sold this project on specific timelines and specific budgets. We have contracts with suppliers and subcontractors built around the current design. Grant's already circulating projected revenue from future projects that haven't even been approved yet, based on Summit Arc's success. I understand the commercial implications. Do you?" Victoria's voice was sharp. "Because I don't think you do. I don't think you understand that if we pause this project, we might lose it entirely. That Titan Ridge could go from industry leader to cautionary tale in the time it takes for one board meeting to go wrong. That people, good people who work here, who have families and mortgages and lives built around this company, could lose everything because an engineer decided to be a hero." Daniel felt heat rise in his face, but he kept his voice level. "I'm not trying to be a hero. I'm trying to prevent a building from failing. In 15 years, maybe 20, based on models and projections and assumptions about material degradation that might not even be accurate. The models are conservative. If anything, I'm underestimating the risk." Victoria studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she did something Daniel didn't expect. She smiled, not warmly, but with a kind of grim recognition. "I've spent 4 years at this firm learning to speak 2 languages, she said. "There's the language of engineering, which deals in facts and forces and structural integrity. And there's the language of business, which deals in perception and positioning and quarterly earnings. Most days I can translate between them, but some days they're mutually incomprehensible. She pulled up something on her computer, then turned the screen toward Daniel. It was a financial projection, complex enough that he couldn't parse it quickly, but the bottom line was clear. Summit Arc Tower represented 30% of Titan Ridge's projected revenue for the next 3 years. If this project fails, Victoria said quietly, the firm fails. Not might fail, will fail. We're leveraged against it. We've made commitments based on it. We've built our reputation around it. She closed the laptop. So here's my question, Hayes. Are you willing to bet your career, your daughter's stability, and the livelihoods of 300 people in this building that your calculations are right and everyone else's are wrong? The question was designed to make him back down. Daniel could see the strategy. Make the stakes personal, make the responsibility overwhelming, make silence seem like the rational choice. But all he could think about was Lily asking him what to do when you know you're right, but everyone says you're wrong. Yes, Daniel said, I'm willing to bet exactly that. Because if I'm right and we do nothing, people die. If I'm wrong and we fix it anyway, we build a stronger building. The math isn't complicated. Victoria was quiet for a long time. Then she stood, walked back to the window, and did something that shocked Daniel more than anything else that morning. She gripped the edge of the window frame, knuckles white, and took 3 deliberate breaths. When she turned back, her face was carefully neutral, but Daniel saw something in her eyes that looked like fear. I'm going to tell you something that no one else in this company knows, Victoria said. And if you ever repeat it, I'll deny it and destroy your credibility so thoroughly you'll never work in this industry again. Understood? Understood? I'm terrified of heights, not uncomfortable, not cautious, genuinely, physically terrified. I can't go above the 10th floor without medication. I can't stand near windows without feeling like I'm falling. I chose structural engineering because I thought understanding the physics would cure the fear. It didn't. It just gave me better vocabulary for my nightmares. Daniel didn't know what to say. The managing partner of a major development firm, working in a tower, approving high-rise projects. Every day I come to this office is an act of willpower, Victoria continued. Every presentation I give in a conference room with windows is a controlled panic attack. Every time I approve a building that's taller than I can imagine being comfortable in, I'm making a choice between my fear and my responsibility. She looked directly at Daniel. So when you tell me that a 70-story building might fail, you're not just threatening a project. You're confronting the exact terror I've spent my entire career trying to master through competence. The confession hung between them, raw and unexpected. Why are you telling me this? Daniel asked. Because you need to understand what you're asking me to do. You're not just asking me to fight the board, or manage Grant, or restructure a project. You're asking me to literally stand on top of a building I'm terrified of and tell investors it's safe when I don't believe any building that tall can be safe. You're asking me to face the exact thing I've been running for my entire professional life. Victoria returned to her desk, sitting down with the exhaustion of someone who'd just admitted a secret they'd been carrying too long. But you're also right, she said quietly. The building needs the safety systems, and I'm the only person with enough authority to make it happen. She pulled up a calendar on her screen. I have a board meeting in 60 hours. I need you to prepare a presentation that explains the structural concerns, the proposed solutions, and the revised budget in a way that doesn't make us look incompetent or reckless. Can you do that? Yes. It won't be enough to be right, Hayes. You'll have to be convincing. The board doesn't care about engineering principles. They care about liability and marketability and return on investment. If you can't speak their language, they won't hear you. I'll learn the language. Victoria almost smiled. You have 48 hours. Don't sleep. Don't socialize. Don't do anything except build the most bulletproof case for structural revision that's ever been presented to a corporate board. Because if we walk into that meeting and fail, this conversation never happened. Your concerns are unfounded, and your career at Titan Ridge is over. Clear? Clear. Good. Now get out of my office and make me believe that doing the right thing won't destroy everything I've built. Daniel stood, gathered his materials, and headed for the door. He paused at the threshold. Miss Cole? What? Thank you for listening. She didn't look up from her computer. Don't thank me yet. Thank me if we survive this. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of calculations, cost analyses, and late-night conversations with materials suppliers about accelerated delivery schedules. Daniel worked from the office until midnight, went home to sleep for 4 hours, had breakfast with Lily where he tried and failed to seem present, and returned to the office before dawn. Lily noticed. Of course she noticed. Is work okay? She asked Thursday morning, pushing scrambled eggs around her plate. Work is complicated, Daniel admitted, but I'm handling it. Is it about the tower? The really tall one? He looked at her, surprised. How do you know about that? You left your drawings on the kitchen table last week. I saw the building. It's so tall. She paused, fork suspended. Are you making sure it's safe? I'm trying to. Good. She said it with such simple conviction, such absolute faith that her father would do the right thing, that Daniel felt the weight of it settle onto his shoulders like a physical thing. Mom always said you were the best at making sure things didn't fall down. Daniel reached across the table and squeezed her hand. I love you, Lilybug. I love you too, Dad, even when you're distracted and tired and pretending you're not worried. She was too perceptive for 12, or maybe exactly perceptive enough. By Friday morning, Daniel had a presentation that combined structural analysis with financial modeling, risk assessment with liability protection, engineering integrity with business strategy. He'd worked with Victoria's assistant to format it in the visual language the board expected, and he'd practiced his delivery until he could explain complex structural concepts in terms that sounded like profit protection rather than technical anxiety. Grant found him in the office at 7:30 a.m., 2 hours before the board meeting. Heard you've been burning the midnight oil, Grant said, leaning against Daniel's cubicle wall with studied casualness. Working on something interesting? Just preparing for a presentation. The board meeting? That's Victoria's show. Since when does she need support staff in the room? Daniel didn't answer. There was no good way to navigate this conversation. Grant's expression hardened. You went over my head. You took concerns I specifically told you were unfounded, and you went straight to the managing partner. I had structural concerns. She's the structural lead. She's also got enough on her plate without mid-level engineers undermining approved projects. Do you have any idea what you've started? I started a conversation about building safety. You started a political nightmare. Grant straightened, dropping the casual pretense. If you walk into that board meeting and make the firm look incompetent, if you cost us investor confidence or project delays or public embarrassment, there will be consequences. Not just for you, for everyone who gets dragged down when this blows up in your face. The only thing that's going to blow up is the building if we don't fix the structural deficiencies. You self-righteous... Grant stopped himself, visibly controlling his anger. You know what? Fine. Present your concerns. Explain to the board why the mid-level engineer knows better than the senior partners and the consultants we paid hundreds of thousands of dollars. I'm sure they'll be impressed by your courage. He walked away without waiting for a response, leaving Daniel alone with his presentation and the growing certainty that he'd just made an enemy who wouldn't forget. At 9:45 a.m., Victoria's assistant came to collect him. The boardroom occupied the top floor of the Titan Ridge building, a space designed to impress with floor-to-ceiling windows and a conference table that could seat 30 people comfortably. Daniel had never been in it before. Looking at the windows, at the way they revealed the city spread out hundreds of feet below, he understood exactly why Victoria had confessed her fear. The board members were already assembled, 12 people representing the firm's investors, senior partners, and external advisors. Grant sat near the head of the table, expression carefully neutral. Victoria stood at the front of the room, computer connected to the projection system, waiting. She looked at Daniel, and for just a moment he saw past the professional armor to the person underneath, someone who was about to do the thing she feared most because it was the right thing to do. Gentlemen, Victoria said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd learned to hide fear under competence. We have a structural concern regarding Summit Arc Tower that requires immediate board attention. Daniel Hayes, our senior structural engineer, will present the analysis. Daniel moved to the front of the room, connected his laptop, and pulled up the first slide. The next hour would determine everything. He took a breath, looked at the faces watching him with varying degrees of skepticism and impatience, and began. Summit Arc Tower, as currently designed, will stand for approximately 15 to 20 years before experiencing catastrophic structural failure during a significant seismic event. I'm here to explain why that's unacceptable and what we need to do to prevent it. The room erupted. 3 voices spoke at once. A board member Daniel didn't recognize half stood from his chair, face already reddening. Grant's expression shifted from neutral to hostile in the space of a heartbeat. And somewhere near the middle of the table, a woman with silver hair and steel-rimmed glasses simply raised one hand, and the room fell silent. "Let him finish," she said. Her voice carried the kind of authority that came from decades of being listened to. Daniel would learn later that she was Margaret Chen, the firm's largest private investor, and the person who'd brought Victoria to Titan Ridge in the first place. Daniel advanced to the next slide, showing the building's vertical support system with the secondary reinforcement highlighted in red. The current design eliminates these support elements to reduce steel costs by approximately $8 million. In a standard 30-story building, this optimization would be aggressive but defensible. In a 70-story tower in a seismic zone 3, it's a delayed catastrophe. "We have 3 independent engineering consultants who approved this design," Grant interjected. "Are you suggesting they're all wrong?" "I'm suggesting they all answered the question they were asked," Daniel replied, keeping his voice steady. Which was, does this design meet minimum code requirements? The answer to that question is yes. But the question we should have asked is, will this building protect lives under realistic long-term stress conditions? The answer to that question is no. He pulled up a simulation model, the kind of thing most board members wouldn't fully understand but would recognize as serious technical work. This shows the load distribution during a magnitude 6.5 earthquake, which we can expect approximately every 20 to 30 years in this region. The current design experiences stress concentration at these junction points. He indicated the areas where cross-bracing connected to vertical columns that exceeds the material's fatigue threshold after 15 years of normal settling and thermal cycling. "Exceeds by how much?" Margaret asked. "By 18 to 22%, depending on maintenance conditions and environmental factors." "And with the secondary reinforcement restored, stress levels remain within safe parameters even after 50 years of operation." Margaret made a note on the tablet in front of her. Daniel couldn't tell if that was good or bad. Grant leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Let me make sure I understand what you're proposing. You want to halt construction, redesign major structural elements, and add $8 million in costs to address a theoretical failure that might occur 2 decades from now, based on your personal analysis that contradicts 3 firms we've already paid to provide this exact expertise." "I want to build a safe building," Daniel said simply. "The rest is just logistics. The rest is the difference between a profitable project and a financial disaster," Grant shot back. "We have contracts. We have commitments. We have investors who were promised specific returns based on specific budgets. What you're proposing doesn't just affect this project. It affects every future project. Our bonding capacity, our insurance rates, our reputation in the market. And if the building fails," Daniel asked quietly, "what does that do to our reputation?" "It won't fail. It meets code. It's been approved by—" "Meeting code and being safe aren't always the same thing," Daniel interrupted. The boldness of it surprised him. "Code is minimum standard. It's the lowest acceptable threshold. We don't design buildings to barely meet code. We design them to exceed it because we're professionals who understand that real-world conditions don't match theoretical models perfectly. Because we know that materials degrade and maintenance isn't always perfect, and earthquakes don't read the engineering specifications before they strike." The room had gone very quiet. Victoria was watching Daniel with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between approval and concern. "How long would the redesign take?" Margaret asked. Victoria answered before Daniel could. 6 to 8 weeks for engineering, another 4 to 6 weeks to procure the additional materials. We'd need to pause construction at the 15th floor and potentially reinforce some of what's already been built. "And the cost?" $8 million in materials. Another $2 to $3 million in scheduled delay costs, contractor standby fees, and permit modifications. Total project impact of approximately $11 million. A man at the far end of the table, someone Daniel recognized as the CFO, whistled low. That's nearly 15% over budget on a project we've already sold to investors at fixed pricing. Which is why we need to make this decision now, Victoria said. Before we're even further into construction. Before the costs become truly prohibitive. Before we're committed to a design we know has long-term vulnerabilities. Grant stood up, the movement sharp enough to draw every eye. This is insane. We're talking about rebuilding a project that's already been approved, already been engineered, already been sold to investors, because one engineer has a theory about what might happen 15 years from now. Do you know what the board at Berkshire Tower would say if we came to them with this? I know what they'd say if we built them a tower that collapsed, Margaret replied coolly. I imagine it would involve lawsuits and criminal negligence charges. That's a false equivalence, and you know it, Grant said. But there was an edge of desperation in his voice now. Buildings don't just collapse. There are inspections, maintenance protocols, monitoring systems. If there were any actual problems, they'd be detected and addressed long before they became critical. Would they? Daniel asked. Because I can show you 3 high-rise failures in the last decade where engineers missed critical signs because they assumed monitoring would catch problems, where maintenance was deferred because budgets were tight, where warning signs were dismissed because no one wanted to believe a building that met code could fail. He pulled up another slide, one he'd debated including because it was visceral and manipulative and would make people angry. But it was also true. Photographs of collapsed buildings, not from earthquakes or terrorist attacks, but from structural failures, steel twisted like paper, concrete reduced to rubble, and in one image, emergency responders carrying someone out of the debris. These buildings all met code, Daniel said quietly. They all had engineering consultants who signed off on the designs. They all had investors who prioritized budget over safety, and they all killed people who trusted that the professionals involved valued human lives more than profit margins. That's enough, Grant said sharply. You're being deliberately inflammatory and manipulative. I'm being honest about the stakes. You're being a sanctimonious engineer who thinks he's smarter than everyone else in the room. I think I'm the only person in this room who's willing to say out loud that we made a mistake, Daniel replied, and felt something shift inside himself as he said it. 20 years of being quiet, of being careful, of making himself small, it all fell away in that moment. We designed a building to a budget instead of a standard. We let financial pressure override engineering judgment. And now we have a choice. Do we fix it while we still can, or do we hope we get lucky for 2 decades and nothing bad happens? Victoria stepped forward, reclaiming control of the room before the argument could spiral further. The question before this board is straightforward. Do we proceed with the current design and accept the long-term structural risk, or do we implement the safety revisions and absorb the cost overruns? I'm recommending the revisions. You're recommending we take an $11 million loss on a flagship project because your engineer has concerns the consultants don't share, Grant said. I'm recommending we do what's right. What's right is honoring our commitments and delivering what we promised to investors. Margaret Chen cleared her throat, a small sound that somehow commanded immediate attention. I'd like to hear from the consultants. Before we make any decisions, I want the engineering firms who approved this design to review Mr. Hayes' analysis and provide their assessment. Can we arrange that by Monday? Victoria nodded. I'll have their contracts amended to include structural review of the proposed modifications. Good. Then we table this decision until we have independent verification of these concerns. Margaret looked directly at Daniel. Mr. Hayes, you'll make yourself available to present your full analysis to the consulting teams? Yes, ma'am. And you stand behind these calculations? You're willing to stake your professional reputation on this assessment? The room was absolutely silent. Daniel felt the weight of every eye, every doubt, every unspoken question about whether he was brave or foolish or simply wrong. He thought about Lily, about the promise he'd made to always tell her the truth, even when it was hard. He thought about his wife, who'd never once asked him to be anything other than exactly who he was. Yes, he said clearly, I stand behind this analysis completely. Margaret made another note. Then we meet again Monday at 9 a.m. Victoria, I want a full financial impact assessment ready. Grant, I want contingency plans for how we manage investor relations if we proceed with modifications. And Hayes, I want you to be absolutely certain you're right, because if you're not, you've just cost a lot of people a lot of money for nothing. The meeting adjourned with the particular chaos of powerful people trying to process unexpected information. Board members clustered in small groups, voices low but urgent. Grant left without looking at Daniel or Victoria, his assistant trailing behind him with her phone already out. Daniel began disconnecting his laptop, hands steady despite the adrenaline crash that was starting to hit. He'd done it. He'd presented the case, survived the confrontation, and earned a chance to prove his analysis. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like he'd just jumped off a cliff and was waiting to see if his calculations about the fall were correct. Victoria's voice was quiet enough that only he could hear. My office. Now. He followed her out of the boardroom, past the clusters of board members, and through corridors that felt longer and more exposed than they had an hour ago. Nobody spoke to them. Several people looked away. Victoria's office felt different now. The windows that had seemed impressive before just looked dangerous, all that glass and all that empty space beyond it. She closed the door and leaned against it, eyes closed, breathing carefully. Are you okay? Daniel asked. I just stood in a room 44 floors above the ground and told 12 people that our biggest project needs to be redesigned. I'm the opposite of okay. She opened her eyes, pushing away from the door with visible effort. But I'm functional, which is what matters. She moved to her desk, pulling up files with practiced efficiency. The consulting firms will push back. They're not going to want to admit they missed something, especially something this significant. They'll challenge your methodology, question your assumptions, maybe even suggest you're being overcautious to make yourself look important. I know. Do you? Because this isn't going to be a technical discussion in a quiet room. This is going to be professional combat. They're going to try to discredit you, and Grant's going to help them because his entire career trajectory depends on Summit Arc succeeding exactly as planned. I can handle it. Victoria studied him with an intensity that made Daniel want to look away. I think you can, but I need you to understand what you've started. This isn't just about engineering anymore. This is about politics and power and perception. If we win this fight, you'll have enemies in this firm who'll spend years making you pay for it. If we lose, your career here is over. I understand. Do you also understand that I'm putting my own position at risk to back you? That if this goes wrong, the board won't just blame you. They'll blame me for listening to you? That I could lose everything I've built here because I chose to believe an engineer I barely know over consultants and partners I've worked with for years? The question hung between them, sharp and honest. Why did you? Daniel asked. Believe me, you could have dismissed my concerns, backed the original design, and none of this would be happening. Victoria was quiet for a long moment. Then she walked to the window, looking down at the construction site where Summit Arc was rising from the earth, all steel skeleton and ambitious geometry. Because 15 years from now, when that building either stands or falls, I'll know that I made a choice. And I'd rather be professionally destroyed for doing the right thing than professionally successful while people die because I was too afraid to listen. She turned back to Daniel. My fear of heights? It's not really about the height. It's about the fall, about losing control, about the moment when physics takes over and choice becomes irrelevant. I became an engineer because I thought understanding the forces meant I could prevent the fall. But lately, I've realized that preventing the fall sometimes means facing the fear before anything goes wrong. She returned to her desk, pulling up the calendar. You have the weekend to prepare for Monday. I'm arranging meetings with the 3 consulting firms, separate sessions so they can't coordinate their responses. You'll present your analysis, answer their questions, and defend your methodology. I'll be in every meeting as the technical lead, but they'll be coming after you, not me. I'll be ready. I hope so. Because this is the last quiet moment you're going to have for a while. Victoria looked at him with something that might have been respect or might have been sympathy. Go home, Hayes. Spend time with your daughter. Have a normal evening, because starting Monday, normal is over. Daniel drove home in the kind of daze that comes from adrenaline exhaustion. The city passed by his windows in a blur of afternoon light and traffic, and he found himself noticing things he usually missed. The way buildings stood against the sky, The implicit trust that everyone who entered them would be safe. The invisible architecture of faith that held civilization together. Lily was already home when he arrived, doing homework at the kitchen table with the particular intensity she brought to anything involving numbers. She looked up when he came in, and Daniel saw his wife's perception in their daughter's eyes. "How was the meeting?" she asked. "Complicated." "Did you tell them about the building?" "I did." "What did they say?" Daniel set down his briefcase, pulled out the chair across from her, and decided that his 12-year-old daughter deserved the truth. "Some of them believed me. Some of them didn't. And some of them are angry that I brought it up at all." Lily processed this with the seriousness it deserved. "But you were right to tell them." "I think so. I hope so." "Mom would say you were right." She said it with the kind of certainty that children have about their parents, the absolute conviction that some truths are self-evident. She always said that doing the right thing isn't about whether people like you for it. It's about whether you can live with yourself if you don't. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest, that particular ache of missing someone who'd been gone long enough that the pain was familiar but still sharp. Your mom was usually right about those things. Then you did the right thing. Lily returned to her homework as if the matter was settled, as if moral clarity was really that simple. Maybe, Daniel thought, it was. Maybe everything complicated about the situation was people trying to make simple truths more complex so they didn't have to follow them. They had dinner together, just the two of them, and talked about things that had nothing to do with structural engineering or corporate politics. Lily told him about the science fair project she was planning, something involving water filtration and testing different materials for efficiency. She explained the methodology with the same precision Daniel used when talking about load calculations, and he felt a fierce pride mixed with concern. She was going to be brilliant and principled, which meant she was going to have a hard life. But maybe hard was better than easy if easy meant compromising the things that mattered. After Lily went to bed, Daniel sat at the kitchen table with the drawings and calculations he'd brought home, not because he needed to review them, but because he needed to be certain. Absolutely, completely certain that he was right, and that the fight he'd started was worth what it was going to cost. The numbers didn't change. The structural vulnerabilities remained exactly what they'd been when he first identified them. The building, as currently designed, would stand until it didn't, and when it failed, people would die. He thought about Victoria, about the confession she'd made about her fear of heights, about the courage it took to face that fear every single day, to work in a tower when towers terrified her, to approve buildings she couldn't imagine being safe in, about the kind of strength it required to build a career on mastering the thing you feared most. And he thought about what she'd said, about the fall being inevitable once physics took over, about choice mattering only in the moments before control was lost. He was making a choice. They all were. And the consequences would ripple forward for years, for decades, into a future none of them could fully see. His phone buzzed. A text from Victoria, sent at 11 p.m. because apparently neither of them slept anymore. Consulting meetings confirmed for Monday. Harper Engineering at 9 a.m., Thornton Associates at 11 a.m., Summit Structural at 2 p.m. Prepare for hostile questioning. Don't back down. Daniel typed back. Understood. Thank you for backing this. Her response came quickly. Thank me if we're both still employed on Tuesday. The weekend passed in a strange suspension of normal life. Daniel worked through his calculations again, refined his presentation, and prepared responses to every criticism he could anticipate. He took Lily to the park on Saturday afternoon and tried to be present while his mind ran through structural models and failure scenarios. They had pizza for dinner and watched a movie, and he held his daughter close and wondered if he'd just destroyed her stability for a principle she was too young to appreciate. On Sunday evening, Mrs. Patterson came over for dinner, bringing the lasagna she always made when she sensed Daniel was stressed. She'd been their neighbor for 8 years, had watched Lily grow up, had been there through his wife's illness and death and the difficult years after. She knew Daniel in the way only neighbors who become family can know someone. You look like a man about to walk into battle, she said, setting the lasagna on the counter. Something like that. The good fight or the stupid fight? Daniel smiled despite himself. I'm not entirely sure there's a difference. There is. Good fights are about protecting something that matters. Stupid fights are about proving you're right. She fixed him with the look that had probably terrified generations of students. Which one is this? Protecting something that matters. Then you'll win. Maybe not the way you expect, maybe not on the timeline you want, but eventually. People who fight for the right reasons tend to win eventually, even if the process destroys them first. It wasn't the most comforting thought, but it was honest. Monday morning arrived with rain, the kind of steady precipitation that made the city look gray and tired. Daniel wore his best suit, the one he'd bought for his wife's funeral and had barely worn since. He dropped Lily at school early and watched her run through the rain toward the building, backpack bouncing, completely unaware that her father's entire career might end before lunchtime. The offices of Harper Engineering occupied 2 floors of a building 3 blocks from Titan Ridge, all glass and polished concrete, and the particular aesthetic of firms that designed airports and stadiums. Daniel arrived 15 minutes early and spent the time in the lobby reviewing his notes, even though he had them memorized. Victoria arrived at 8:55, dressed in black with her hair pulled back so severely it looked painful. She looked like she was dressed for a funeral too. "Ready?" she asked. "As I'll ever be." "They're going to be aggressive. Harper's reputation depends on their structural assessments being reliable. If they admit they missed something this significant, it calls into question every project they've ever consulted on. So they'll attack the methodology instead of addressing the substance." "Exactly. Don't let them derail the conversation with technical minutia. Keep bringing it back to the central question. Is the building safe long-term?" They rode the elevator to the 14th floor in silence. Daniel wondered if Victoria was medicating for this. If being in another tall building was costing her the same kind of courage it had cost her to back his analysis. The conference room was smaller than he'd expected, with a table that sat maybe 8 people and windows that looked out over the city's financial district. 3 people from Harper Engineering were already there, 2 men and 1 woman, all dressed in the kind of business casual that engineers wore when they were trying to look professional without seeming stuffy. The lead consultant was a man named Robert Park, late 50s, with silver hair and the confidence of someone who'd been right about structural analysis more often than he'd been wrong. He stood when Victoria and Daniel entered, shook hands with practiced warmth, and gestured to the seats across from his team. "Victoria, good to see you, and you must be Daniel Hayes." His handshake was firm, but not aggressive, the grip of someone making a point without being obvious about it. "I've read your analysis with great interest." The phrasing was careful. Interest, not agreement, not concern. They sat. Robert pulled up Daniel's calculations on his laptop, the screen mirrored to the presentation display on the wall. "I want to start by saying we appreciate the thoroughness of this review. It's exactly the kind of diligence that makes projects safer. However, we do have some significant concerns about the underlying assumptions." And so it began. For the next 2 hours, Robert and his team challenged every aspect of Daniel's analysis. They questioned his material fatigue models, suggested his seismic load calculations were overly conservative, argued that his failure scenarios didn't account for modern monitoring systems that would detect problems before they became critical. They were smart, prepared, and absolutely committed to defending their original assessment. Daniel countered each point methodically, pulling up supporting research, referencing case studies from similar structures, demonstrating that his assumptions were not only reasonable, but represented standard practice for high-risk structural analysis. He kept his voice level, his responses precise, and refused to be drawn into defensive arguments about his competence or qualifications. "Your model assumes linear material degradation," Robert said, pulling up a graph that showed steel fatigue over time. "But modern metallurgy has significantly improved material performance. The steel we're using in Summit Arc has degradation characteristics that are 30% better than what your model assumes." "I use the manufacturer's own specifications for fatigue performance," Daniel replied. "If you have documentation showing better performance, I'll happily revise the calculations. But I'd need third-party testing verification, not just marketing materials." "Are you suggesting manufacturers lie about material specifications?" "I'm suggesting that laboratory conditions and real-world performance aren't always identical, and conservative estimates protect against that variance." The woman on Robert's team, whose name was Jennifer Lynn, leaned forward. But by that logic, we could never approve any structure because there's always some possibility of material performance falling short of specifications. Engineering requires making informed judgments about acceptable risk. Agreed, Daniel said. And my judgment is that the risk we're accepting with the current design is unacceptable for a residential tower that will house thousands of people over its operational lifetime. Based on a failure scenario that assumes the worst possible combination of factors, Robert interjected. Seismic event, material degradation, lack of monitoring, maintenance failures. The probability of all those factors aligning is extremely low. The probability of each factor individually is high, Daniel countered. We will have earthquakes in this region. Materials will degrade. Monitoring systems fail or get deferred due to budget constraints. Maintenance gets postponed. These aren't unlikely scenarios. They're historical certainties. The debate continued, technical and intense, both sides marshaling evidence and expertise. Victoria watched without intervening, letting Daniel carry the argument. He could feel her support in the silence, the implicit trust that he could defend his work without her protection. Finally, Robert sat back, exchanging glances with his team. I think we've explored the technical disagreements thoroughly. Here's our position. Your analysis identifies potential vulnerabilities that we assessed differently in our original review. Our assessment was that the structural redundancy built into the design, even without the secondary reinforcement system, provides adequate safety margins. Your assessment is that adequate isn't sufficient. That's a judgment call, not a technical absolute. And if that judgment is wrong, Daniel asked? If we're wrong, the building undergoes additional stress during a major seismic event and requires repairs. If you're wrong, Titan Ridge spends $11 million solving a problem that doesn't exist. The question is which error we're more comfortable making. Victoria spoke for the first time in an hour. We're more comfortable making the expensive error because the alternative is catastrophic. Robert nodded slowly. Then that's a business decision, not an engineering one. Our technical assessment stands. The building as designed meets code and represents sound engineering practice. If Titan Ridge chooses to exceed those standards, that's their prerogative. But it's not because our analysis was wrong. It wasn't a concession, but it wasn't a complete refutation either. Robert was protecting his firm's reputation while leaving room for Victoria to make the decision she'd already decided to make. They left Harper Engineering at 11:15, 15 minutes late for the next meeting. Victoria was silent in the elevator, in the car, all the way to the offices of Thornton Associates. Daniel couldn't tell if the silence was good or bad. You held your ground, she finally said as they pulled into the parking garage. That's good. But they didn't budge, which means the next two firms won't either. They'll all protect each other's reputations because admitting one of them was wrong calls all of them into question. So what do? We make the case that we're not saying they were wrong. We're saying standards have evolved, and we're choosing to exceed minimum requirements. Professional courtesy, not professional challenge. The meeting with Thornton Associates followed the same pattern: technical challenges, methodological debates, and ultimately a conclusion that Daniel's concerns were valid but conservative, exceeding what code required without proving the code was insufficient. By the time they reached Summit Structural at 2 p.m., Daniel was exhausted from defending the same points repeatedly. The third meeting added nothing new, just another variation of the same message. The consultants stood by their work, disagreed with Daniel's assessment, but couldn't definitively prove he was wrong. It was nearly 5 p.m. when they returned to Titan Ridge. Victoria went straight to her office to compile the consultants' responses into a report for the board. Daniel returned to his desk to find Grant waiting, leaning against the cubicle wall with his arms crossed. 3 meetings, 3 firms telling you you're wrong, Grant said without preamble. Still feel good about blowing up the project? They didn't say I was wrong. They said they assessed the risk differently, which is consultant speak for this guy's being paranoid. You had your shot, Hayes. You made your case. The experts disagree. Time to step back and let the adults make the decision. Daniel was too tired for diplomacy. The adults are the ones who cut safety systems to save money. I'm trying to fix what the adults broke. Grant's expression hardened. You self-righteous. You think you're some kind of hero? You're a mid-level engineer with delusions of importance. This firm was building towers before you got here, and will build them long after you're gone. The only thing you've accomplished is making yourself radioactive. Nobody's going to want to work with the guy who undermines approved projects and wastes everyone's time second-guessing decisions that have already been made. If the decision was right, it should hold up to scrutiny. The decision has held up to scrutiny from 3 independent firms. Your scrutiny doesn't count more than theirs just because you're louder about it. Daniel stood up, meeting Grant's eyes directly. I'm not louder. I'm just willing to say what they're all thinking, but won't admit because it's expensive and inconvenient and might make people angry. The building needs the safety systems. You know it. They know it. Everyone in that boardroom knows it. The only question is whether protecting profit margins matters more than protecting lives. Get out of my sight, Grant said quietly, before I say something that ends with HR involvement. Daniel left, walking past colleagues who'd clearly heard the confrontation and didn't know where to look. He felt the weight of their judgment, their confusion, their calculations about whether associating with him was career suicide. He didn't care anymore. He rode the elevator down to the parking garage, sat in his car, and allowed himself exactly 60 seconds of doubt. 60 seconds to wonder if he'd just destroyed his career for nothing, if his certainty was really just stubbornness, if maybe everyone else was right and he was the one who couldn't see it. Then the 60 seconds ended and he drove home to have dinner with his daughter. Lily was setting the table when he walked in, arranging plates and silverware with the careful precision she brought to everything. She looked up, saw something in his face, and immediately stopped what she was doing. "Bad day?" she asked. "Long day," Daniel corrected, setting his briefcase by the door. "How was school?" "Don't do that." She crossed her arms, looking so much like her mother in that moment that Daniel felt his breath catch. "Don't pretend you're fine when you're not. You always tell me to be honest about how I'm feeling." He sat down at the table, suddenly exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the physical demands of the day. "You're right. I'm sorry. It was a hard day. I had to defend my work to people who didn't want to hear it, and I'm not sure I convinced anyone." Lily sat down across from him, her homework forgotten. "But you were right about the building being unsafe?" "I believe so. But belief isn't the same as proof. And sometimes people don't want to accept proof when it's expensive or inconvenient. That's stupid. That's human nature." She was quiet for a moment, thinking with the intensity she inherited from both her parents. "At school, when I told Mr. Henderson that his calculation on the board was wrong, he got mad at me. He said I was being disrespectful. But the answer was wrong. I checked it 3 times. Eventually, he looked at it again and fixed it, but he never said I was right. He just acted like he'd made a small mistake that didn't matter." "Did it matter?" Daniel asked. "It mattered that the answer was wrong. It mattered that other kids were copying down the wrong formula. It mattered that being right isn't the same as being popular." She looked at her father with those serious, searching eyes. "You taught me that. You and Mom. So don't tell me now that being right doesn't matter when it's hard." Daniel reached across the table and took her hand. "Being right always matters. I just wish it didn't always have to be so complicated." "Nothing worth doing is easy," Lily said, and Daniel realized with a mixture of pride and pain that his 12-year-old daughter was braver than he was. "That's what Mom used to say, when I didn't want to do physical therapy after I broke my arm, when I wanted to quit piano because the songs were too hard. She always said if it was easy, everyone would do it, and then it wouldn't mean anything to be good at it." They had dinner together, pasta with the sauce Lily had learned to make from a cooking video, and talked about her science fair project and Mrs. Patterson's new garden, and everything except the thing that was consuming Daniel's thoughts. After Lily went to bed, he sat in the quiet kitchen and allowed himself to think about what tomorrow would bring. The board meeting was at 9 a.m. Victoria would present the consultant reports, the cost analysis, and her recommendation. The board would vote. And Daniel's entire professional future would be decided by people who measured success in quarterly returns and market positioning, not structural integrity and long-term safety. His phone buzzed. A message from Victoria, sent at 10:30 p.m. "The consultant's reports are diplomatic but not supportive. Margaret's leaning toward the revisions, but she's only 1 vote. Grant's been lobbying the other board members all evening. This is going to be close." Daniel stared at the message, then typed, "What do you need from me? Prayer might help if you're the praying type. I'm the engineering type." Then run your calculations one more time. Make absolutely sure. Because if we're wrong about this, we'll never work in this industry again. He pulled out his laptop and did exactly that, working through the structural models with the obsessive precision of someone who needed to be certain. The numbers didn't change. They never changed. The building needed the safety systems, or eventually, not immediately, not dramatically, but inevitably, it would fail. At midnight, he sent Victoria a single message. "I'm sure." Her response came immediately, as if she'd been waiting. "Then we fight." The morning arrived with clear skies and the particular brightness that made the city look optimistic, as if the weather itself was refusing to acknowledge the tension of the day. Daniel dropped Lily at school with a longer hug than usual, holding on to her small, fierce certainty for just a moment before letting her go into the building. "You'll do the right thing," she said as she opened the car door. Not a question, a statement of absolute faith. "I'll try," he promised. "You'll succeed," she corrected, and walked into school without looking back. Daniel arrived at Titan Ridge 30 minutes before the board meeting, enough time to feel the atmosphere in the office. People were quieter than usual, conversations stopping when he walked past, eyes following him with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Word had spread. The quiet engineer was making noise, and nobody knew whether to admire him or avoid him. Victoria's assistant intercepted him before he reached his desk. "She wants you in the boardroom 15 minutes early, and she said to bring your confidence, whatever that means." The boardroom felt different than it had last week. Smaller somehow, more exposed. Victoria was already there, standing at the windows and looking down at the construction site. She turned when Daniel entered, and he saw that she was holding onto the window frame with white knuckles. "Exposure therapy," she said, following his gaze. "My therapist says the only way to overcome fear is to face it deliberately, in controlled doses. So I stand here every morning before important meetings and remind myself that the glass is engineered to hold, that the building is structurally sound, that understanding the physics means I control the fear instead of the fear controlling me." "Does it work?" Daniel asked. "Not even a little bit. But I do it anyway because if I can force myself to stand at this window, I can force myself to do anything else the day requires." She released the frame and moved away from the glass, visibly steadying herself. "The board's going to vote today. Margaret's with us, but we need at least 6 votes to approve the modifications. Grant secured at least 4 votes against. The other 3 are undecided." "What changes their minds?" "I don't know. Facts haven't worked. Financial analysis hasn't worked. Liability concerns haven't moved them. They're treating this as a business decision when it's a moral one, and I don't know how to translate morality into quarterly projections." The door opened and board members began filing in, their expressions ranging from interested to irritated. Grant arrived last, walking in with the confidence of someone who'd spent the last week building alliances and calling in favors. He didn't look at Daniel or Victoria. Margaret called the meeting to order at exactly 9 a.m. "We're here to make a final decision on the Summit Arc structural modifications. Victoria, you have the floor." Victoria pulled up her presentation, and Daniel saw immediately that she'd changed her approach. Instead of leading with engineering concerns or cost analysis, she opened with a single image, a photograph of Summit Arc Tower as it would look when completed, gleaming against the skyline, windows reflecting sunset light. "This is what we're building," she said. 70 stories, 300 residential units. Retail space that will anchor the downtown revitalization. A landmark that will define this city's skyline for generations. It's extraordinary. It's ambitious. And as currently designed, it's vulnerable to structural failure during seismic events that we can reasonably expect within its operational lifetime. She advanced to the next slide, showing the consultant reports in summary form. 3 independent engineering firms reviewed Daniel Hayes' analysis. None of them found technical errors in his calculations. None of them could definitively refute his failure scenarios. What they said, uniformly, is that the current design meets minimum code requirements and represents standard industry practice. "Then what's the problem?" one of the board members asked, a man named Charles Whitmore, who represented a major investment group. "The problem is that standard practice isn't the same as best practice. The problem is that meeting minimum requirements isn't the same as maximizing safety. The problem is that we have an opportunity to build something better than code requires, and we're choosing not to because it's expensive." Grant leaned forward. We're choosing not to because the expense isn't justified. The building is safe as designed. Making it safer than necessary is expensive virtue signaling, not sound business practice. It's not virtue signaling to protect human lives, Victoria shot back. It's basic professional responsibility. Professional responsibility is delivering what we promised to investors on the budget we committed to, Grant replied. Not redesigning approved projects because one engineer has theoretical concerns that none of the consultants share. They didn't say they don't share the concerns, Victoria corrected. They said they assess the risk differently. That's not the same as saying Hayes is wrong. Margaret raised her hand, cutting off the argument before it could spiral. Let's focus on the decision at hand. Victoria, what exactly are you proposing? I'm proposing we implement the structural modifications Daniel identified. Full secondary reinforcement system, reduced cross-bracing intervals, additional redundancy in the vertical support columns, total cost impact of $11 million split between materials and schedule delays. The modifications can be completed within 4 months without compromising the overall project timeline significantly. Significantly is doing a lot of work in that sentence, Charles said. 4 months is an entire quarter. Do you know what that does to our cash flow projections? To our ability to secure financing for the next 3 projects? To investor confidence in our ability to deliver on commitments? I know exactly what it does, Victoria said quietly. I also know what a structural failure does. I know what it's like to stand in front of television cameras and explain why a building collapsed. I know what it's like to have your professional reputation destroyed because you prioritize budget over safety. And I know what it's like to live with the knowledge that people died because you were too afraid or too greedy or too concerned about your career to do the right thing when you had the chance. The room went very quiet. Daniel realized that Victoria was no longer talking about hypothetical scenarios. She was talking about something personal, something that had happened to her or someone she knew. 10 years ago, Victoria continued, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of pain. I worked on a stadium project in another city. The lead structural engineer raised concerns about the foundation design and soft soil conditions. The concerns were dismissed as overcautious. The project moved forward as planned. 3 years after completion, during a concert, a section of the upper deck collapsed. 43 people were injured. 2 died. She pulled up another slide, and Daniel saw it was a news article with a headline that made his stomach turn. Stadium collapse blamed on design flaws. I wasn't the lead engineer, Victoria said. I was junior staff with no authority to stop anything. But I was in the meetings where the concerns were raised and dismissed. I saw the calculations. I knew there was risk, and I said nothing because I was afraid of being wrong, afraid of being difficult, afraid of damaging my career. So when that deck collapsed, I knew that my silence had contributed to it, that my fear had cost people their safety. She looked directly at Grant. I swore then that I would never again stay silent when I knew something was wrong, that I would never prioritize career or budget or investor relations over structural integrity, that I would rather be professionally destroyed for being overcautious than professionally successful while people suffered because I chose convenience over courage. The silence in the room was absolute. Even Grant seemed caught off guard by the confession. What Daniel's asking us to do, Victoria continued, isn't radical or unreasonable. He's asking us to build a building that will protect the people who live in it, work in it, and trust that we valued their safety more than our profit margins. Yes, it's expensive. Yes, it's inconvenient. Yes, it requires us to admit that our original design prioritized cost savings over optimal safety. But the alternative is standing here in 15 years, looking at cameras, explaining why we knew there was risk and chose to ignore it. Margaret was watching Victoria with an expression that Daniel couldn't quite read. The consultant reports say the risk is theoretical. All risk is theoretical until it becomes reality, Victoria replied. The question is whether we wait for reality to prove us wrong, or whether we act now while we still can. Charles spoke up again, his tone more measured now. I appreciate the passion, Victoria, and I understand the personal history driving it, but we have fiduciary responsibility to our investors. We can't make decisions based on emotion or past trauma. We need to make them based on objective assessment of risk versus cost. Then let's talk about objective risk, Daniel said, speaking for the first time. He He pulled up a slide he'd prepared but hadn't planned to use, showing insurance industry data on structural failures and their financial impact. The average cost of a major building collapse, including lawsuits, settlements, regulatory fines, and reputation damage, is approximately $300 million. That's not counting the criminal liability exposure for executives and board members who approved unsafe designs. The cost of implementing these modifications is $11 million. From a purely financial perspective, we're buying insurance against a $300 million liability for less than 4% of that exposure. He advanced to the next slide, showing data on structural failures in buildings that met code. In the last 20 years, there have been 17 significant structural failures in buildings that passed all required inspections and met all code requirements. Every single one of them involved budget optimizations that reduced safety margins below what engineers recommended. Every single one resulted in lawsuits claiming professional negligence. And in 14 of those cases, executives and board members were held personally liable. The room had gotten very attentive very quickly. Personal liability tended to focus attention in ways that abstract safety concerns didn't. What you're voting on today, Daniel continued, isn't whether to spend $11 million on unnecessary modifications. You're voting on whether to accept known structural vulnerabilities and the legal liability that comes with them, or to spend a fraction of your potential exposure to eliminate that risk entirely. From a business perspective, it's the easiest decision you'll make all year. Grant's expression had shifted from confident to concerned. He'd been prepared to argue about engineering philosophy and corporate responsibility. He hadn't been prepared for a direct assault on the board member's personal liability exposure. "That's fear-mongering," Grant said, but there was less conviction in his voice now. "You're suggesting that board members could be criminally liable for approving a design that meets code and was verified by consultants." "I'm not suggesting it," Daniel replied. "I'm stating it as established legal precedent. When engineers raise safety concerns and those concerns are dismissed, and when structures subsequently fail, courts have consistently held decision-makers liable regardless of whether the design met minimum code requirements, particularly when there's documentary evidence that the concerns were known and ignored." He looked at each board member in turn. "Everything we've discussed in these meetings is documented. Every email, every presentation, every consultant report. If this building fails, all of that becomes evidence in a negligence case. And the central question will be very simple. Did you know there was risk, and did you choose profit over safety? The answer to both questions is yes. That documentation exists, and no amount of insurance will protect you from that exposure." Margaret was making notes on her tablet, her expression thoughtful. "How certain are you about the failure scenario? Give me a percentage." But Daniel had been expecting this question and had spent considerable time thinking about how to answer it honestly. Structural engineering doesn't deal in certainties, but based on conservative models using industry-standard methodologies, I'd say there's a 60 to 70% probability of significant structural damage during a major seismic event after 15 years of operation, and an 80 to 90% probability after 25 years. And with the modifications, less than 5% even after 50 years of operation and multiple seismic events. Margaret looked at Charles, then at the other undecided board members. "I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm not comfortable with those odds. Not when the solution costs less than what we spend on marketing." "It costs less than marketing now," Grant interjected, "but it sets a precedent that every project can be redesigned mid-construction based on theoretical concerns. It tells our competitors that Titan Ridge doesn't trust its own engineering. It tells investors that our budgets are unreliable. The long-term cost is much higher than $11 million. The long-term cost of a structural failure is higher than our entire company valuation," Margaret countered. "I'm calling for a vote. All in favor of implementing the structural modifications as proposed?" Margaret's hand went up immediately. Two other board members followed, older members who Daniel guessed had lived through enough corporate scandals to know that liability exposure was real. Then, after a pause that seemed to stretch forever, two more hands rose. Board members who'd been undecided and had apparently been swayed by the liability argument. That was 5 votes, one short of approval. The remaining undecided board member was a woman named Patricia Hoffman, who'd been silent through most of the meeting. She sat with her hands folded on the table, looking at the financial projections Victoria had presented. "Patricia?" Margaret prompted gently. "I'm thinking about my granddaughter," Patricia said quietly. "She's 24, just graduated, looking at apartments in the city. She could end up living in Summit Arc. And I'm sitting here thinking about whether I'm willing to tell her she's safe in a building I approved when I knew there were concerns about its long-term stability." She looked up, meeting Margaret's eyes. "I'm not willing to do that. I vote yes for the modifications." 6 votes. It was done. Grant sat back in his chair, his expression carefully controlled but his jaw tight with suppressed anger. "I want it on record that I oppose this decision, that I believe it's financially irresponsible and sets a dangerous precedent, and that when this project comes in over budget and behind schedule, the responsibility lies with the board members who prioritize theoretical risk over fiduciary duty." "Noted," Margaret said. "Victoria, you have approval to implement the structural modifications. I want weekly progress reports and immediate notification of any additional cost overruns or schedule complications." "Daniel, excellent work on the analysis. The firm is lucky to have engineers willing to speak up when they see problems." The meeting adjourned, and Daniel felt the adrenaline that had been carrying him through the last week suddenly drain away, leaving him exhausted and oddly empty. He'd won. The building would be safe. People would be protected. So why did he feel like he'd just started a war instead of ending one? Victoria caught his arm as board members filed out. "My office, 10 minutes. Grant left without looking at either of them, but Daniel caught the expression on his face and knew this was far from over. Victoria's office felt different now. The windows were still there, still terrifying, but there was something else in the room, a sense of having faced something difficult and survived. Victoria sat at her desk, pulled up a file, and turned the screen toward Daniel. "This is the revised project timeline," she said. 4 months of modifications starting immediately. I'm assigning you as lead engineer on the structural revisions, reporting directly to me. It's a promotion, senior structural engineer with the salary and benefits that come with it. You've earned it." Daniel stared at the screen, processing what she was saying. A promotion, recognition, everything he'd spent 20 years being invisible to earn. "I don't want you to accept because you think you have to," Victoria continued. "This position will make you a target. Grant's going to spend the next 4 months trying to prove the modifications were unnecessary. Other partners will resent the budget overruns and schedule delays. You'll be blamed for every problem, every setback, every cost that exceeds projections. Taking this position means accepting that you'll never be invisible again." "I don't want to be invisible anymore," Daniel said, surprised by the certainty in his own voice. "I spent 20 years making myself small so I wouldn't cause problems. And my wife died never seeing me fight for anything. I don't want my daughter to grow up thinking that staying quiet and staying safe are the same thing." Victoria smiled, and it was the first genuine smile Daniel had seen from her. "Then welcome to the war, Hayes, because that's what this is now. We won the battle, but Grant's not going to let this go. He's going to make our lives as difficult as possible, and he's going to be watching for any mistake we make." "Let him watch," Daniel said. "We're building a safe building. That's all that matters." "I hope you still believe that in 6 months." Daniel returned to his desk to find a dozen emails already waiting, most of them congratulating him on the promotion, a few subtly asking if he was available for consulting on other projects, and one from Grant that simply said, "We need to talk. My office. Now." Daniel deleted the email and started reviewing the structural modification plans instead. Whatever Grant wanted to say could wait. The building couldn't. But 3 hours later, when Daniel was deep in load calculations and material specifications, Grant appeared at his cubicle anyway. "Ignoring my emails now?" Grant asked. "I was working. What do you need?" "I need you to understand something," Grant said, lowering his voice so only Daniel could hear. "You won today. Congratulations. You got your modifications, your promotion, your moment of heroism. But this firm doesn't reward troublemakers long term. You made the board question approved decisions. You made consultants look unreliable. You made me look like I don't care about safety. Those things don't get forgotten." "I made the building safer," Daniel replied calmly. "Everything else is just politics." "Politics is how careers are built or destroyed in this industry, and you've made some powerful people very uncomfortable. They're going to be watching you now, looking for any excuse to prove you were wrong, that this was all unnecessary paranoia from an engineer with delusions of importance. Then they'll be disappointed, because I'm right. Grant leaned against the cubicle wall, studying Daniel with something that might have been grudging respect or might have been calculation. You really believe that, don't you? That being right is enough? That integrity and competence matter more than relationships and positioning? They should. But they don't, not in the real world. Not in corporations where decisions get made by committees and credit gets distributed politically, and careers depend on being valuable to the right people. Grant straightened. Watch your back, Hayes, because I'll be watching it too, and I won't forget that you made me look incompetent in front of the board. He walked away, leaving Daniel alone with the distinct feeling that the real fight was just beginning. That evening, Daniel picked up Lily from school and took her out for ice cream, a celebration neither of them had planned, but both of them needed. They sat at a small table outside the shop, eating chocolate chip mint and watching the city move past them in its usual chaotic rhythm. You look different, Lily observed, studying her father with that unsettling perceptiveness she'd inherited from her mother. Different how? Taller, maybe? Like you take up more space than you used to. Did something good happen at work? Daniel considered how to explain corporate politics and structural engineering and professional courage to a 12-year-old. Then he decided on the truth, simplified but honest. I won a fight today, he said. A fight about doing the right thing even when it was expensive and difficult and made people angry. And I'm realizing that winning doesn't feel quite how I expected it to. How did you expect it to feel? Like an ending, like everything would be resolved and I could go back to normal. And how does it actually feel? Like a beginning, like I just opened a door I can't close, and I don't know what's on the other side. Lily ate her ice cream thoughtfully, considering this. Mom used to say that doing the right thing doesn't end problems. It just transforms them into different problems that are worth having. Like the problem of being sick is worse than the problem of recovering, even though recovering is hard. The problem of being wrong is worse than the problem of being right, when people don't want to hear it. Your mom was very wise. She was. And she married you, so she must have seen something worth seeing. Daniel laughed, the tension of the day finally breaking. I love you, Lilybug. I love you too, Dad, even when you're fighting battles that transform your problems into different problems. They finished their ice cream and drove home through streets that were starting to fill with rush hour traffic, and Daniel thought about Victoria standing at those windows every morning, facing her fear in controlled doses, about the stadium collapse she'd witnessed and the guilt she'd carried for a decade, about the choice she'd made to back him even though it risked everything she'd built. He thought about his wife, about the promise he'd made to never teach their daughter to make herself smaller, about whether he'd kept that promise or broken it in the 20 years of invisible competence he'd cultivated. And he thought about the building rising from the ground downtown, 70 stories of steel and glass and concrete that would either stand or fall based on the decisions made in boardrooms and engineering offices by people who would never live in it. The weight of it should have been crushing. Instead, it felt like purpose. His phone buzzed as he pulled into the driveway. A message from Victoria. Rooftop investor presentation tomorrow at 4 p.m. 44th floor observation deck. I need you there to answer technical questions about the modifications. Can you handle heights? Daniel looked at the message, thought about Victoria forcing herself to stand at windows she was terrified of, about courage being the decision to act despite fear rather than the absence of fear itself. He typed back, I can handle whatever's necessary. Her response came immediately. Good, because I'm going to need someone to catch me if I fall. Daniel stared at the message, understanding suddenly that this was about more than structural engineering or corporate politics, or even building safety. This was about two people who'd spent their careers making themselves smaller, choosing invisibility over conflict, and who were now being forced to occupy space they'd never imagined claiming. Tomorrow, he'd stand on a rooftop 400 feet above the city and help Victoria face the thing she feared most. He'd answer questions about load calculations and safety margins and material specifications, while the wind reminded them both how high they were, how far the fall would be if the engineering failed. But tonight, he sat at the kitchen table with Lily and helped her with math homework, and felt grateful that for once in his careful, calculated life, he'd chosen courage over comfort. The building would stand. He would make sure of it. And whatever came next, whatever wars Grant wanted to wage, whatever enemies he'd made, whatever professional costs he'd eventually pay, it would be worth it. Because some things mattered more than being invisible. Some things mattered more than being safe. The next morning arrived with wind, the kind that made tall buildings sway imperceptibly and reminded everyone that structures were never truly still. Daniel stood in front of his bathroom mirror, tying his tie and trying not to think about standing on a rooftop 400 feet above the city while that wind pushed against glass barriers that were engineered to hold but felt dangerously insufficient. Lily knocked on the bathroom door frame, already dressed for school. "You look nervous." "I have a presentation on a rooftop today." "Are you afraid of heights?" "I'm afraid of falling," Daniel corrected. "Heights are just distance. Falling is physics." She grinned. "That's such an engineer answer. Mom would have said something about trusting the universe or finding beauty in the risk." "Your mom was braver than I am." "No, she wasn't. She was just scared of different things." Lily adjusted his tie, straightening it with the precision she brought to everything. "You're going to be great. And if you get scared, just remember that the building is designed to hold people at that height." "You trust the engineering, right?" "I do." "Then trust yourself. You're the one who made sure it was safe." Daniel drove Lily to school, then headed downtown with the particular dread of someone who'd committed to doing something uncomfortable and couldn't back out without proving every doubt about himself correct. The offices of Titan Ridge were already buzzing with activity when he arrived, the energy different than usual, sharper, more focused, carrying the tension of a firm that had just made an expensive decision and needed to prove it was the right one. Victoria's assistant intercepted him before he reached his desk. "She wants you in her office now, and she said to bring your patients." Victoria was standing at her window when Daniel entered, but this time she wasn't gripping the frame. She was just standing there, looking down at the construction site, her posture suggesting she'd been there for a while. "Close the door," she said without turning. Daniel did. "I haven't slept in 3 days," Victoria said conversationally. "I've been running worst-case scenarios in my head on a loop. What if the modifications don't work? What if we've spent $11 million solving a problem that wouldn't have occurred anyway? What if I'm wrong and Grant's right and we've just destroyed the firm's credibility for nothing?" "Are those real questions or rhetorical ones?" Daniel asked. "Does it matter?" "It does if you want real answers." Victoria finally turned from the window, and Daniel saw the exhaustion in her face, the cost of standing firm when every instinct screamed to compromise. "The investor presentation this afternoon. It's not just about explaining the modifications. It's about convincing 12 very wealthy people that spending their money on safety systems they can't see was worth delaying their return on investment. Do you know how to make that case to people who measure value in quarterly earnings?" "I know how to explain structural engineering in language that emphasizes liability protection and long-term asset value," Daniel offered. "Beyond that, I'm making it up as I go." "Good, because so am I." She moved to her desk, pulling up the presentation she'd been working on. The observation deck is open air with glass barriers. Wind speeds up there can reach 30 miles per hour. It's designed for it. The barriers are anchored with redundancy systems, and the deck itself has wind load capacity that exceeds code by 40%. Intellectually, I know it's safe. But fear isn't intellectual, Daniel finished. No, it's not. And standing up there while trying to project confidence about structural integrity is going to require every ounce of control I have. She looked at Daniel directly. I need you to do something for me. If I start to lose it up there, if you see me losing control or showing fear, I need you to step in. Take over the presentation. Answer the questions. Don't let them see that their managing partner is terrified of the very thing she's asking them to trust. I won't let you fall, Daniel said, and meant it in more ways than one. I'm counting on it. They spent the morning reviewing the presentation, refining technical explanations into investor-friendly language, and preparing responses to every question they could anticipate. At noon, Grant appeared in Victoria's office doorway without knocking. A word? He said, looking at Victoria. She gestured for Daniel to stay. Anything you need to say to me can be said in front of my senior structural engineer. Grant's jaw tightened, but he stepped inside and closed the door. The investor presentation this afternoon. I think it's a mistake to emphasize the modifications. We should focus on the building's innovative design, its market positioning, its revenue potential. Leading with the fact that we redesigned major structural elements mid-construction makes us look uncertain. We should look certain about uncertain things? Victoria asked mildly. That seems like a recipe for credibility problems later. We should look confident in our decision-making process. Explaining that we stopped construction to address theoretical safety concerns that 3 consultants didn't share makes us look reactive and indecisive. It makes us look responsible, Daniel interjected. It shows that we prioritize safety over schedule and that we're willing to make difficult decisions when new information emerges. Grant turned to Daniel with barely concealed hostility. You've been senior structural engineer for exactly 24 hours. That doesn't make you an expert in investor relations or corporate messaging. This presentation needs to emphasize strength and vision, not doubt and course correction. The modifications are a strength, Victoria said firmly. They demonstrate that Titan Ridge builds to standards that exceed code, that we invest in long-term structural integrity, and that our buildings are engineered to protect occupants under conditions most firms don't even consider. That's a selling point, not a liability. It's a selling point if you frame it right, Grant conceded. But leading with, we had to redesign the building because it wasn't safe is not the right framing. Good thing that's not what we're saying, Victoria replied. We're saying we enhanced the structural systems to exceed industry standards and provide additional long-term safety margins. Precision in language matters, Grant. I suggest you trust that I know how to communicate with investors. Grant looked like he wanted to argue further, but recognized he wasn't going to win. Fine, present it however you want. But when the investors start asking why they're paying for modifications that weren't in the original proposal, don't expect me to help you manage their concerns. He left without waiting for a response, and Victoria sat down heavily in her chair. He's not entirely wrong. The framing matters. If the investors see this as us fixing mistakes, they'll lose confidence. If they see it as us exceeding standards, they'll view it as added value. We need to control that narrative carefully. Then we lead with the earthquake data, Daniel suggested. Show them that this region experiences significant seismic activity every 20 to 30 years. Explain that most buildings are designed to survive these events with damage, while Summit Arc is being designed to survive them without damage. Make it about competitive advantage, not risk mitigation. Victoria pulled up the seismic data, studying it thoughtfully. That could work. Position it as building the safest residential tower in the city, engineered to standards that competitors won't match. Make safety a luxury feature instead of a basic requirement. They spent the next 2 hours reworking the presentation, shifting emphasis from problem-solving to excellence, from risk avoidance to performance optimization. By the time 3:30 arrived, they had something that felt right. A narrative that was honest about the modifications, but positioned them as evidence of superior engineering rather than reactive correction. The observation deck occupied the 44th floor, an open-air space with glass barriers that offered 360-degree views of the city. Daniel stepped out of the elevator and immediately felt the wind, steady and strong, carrying the smell of rain from clouds gathering on the horizon. The deck was empty except for the catering staff setting up a bar and arranging chairs for the presentation. Victoria emerged from the elevator 30 seconds later, and Daniel saw her face go pale the moment she registered where she was. She stopped just outside the elevator, one hand gripping the door frame, breathing with deliberate control. "It's fine," she said, more to herself than to Daniel. "It's engineered. It's safe. Physics is on my side." "Do you want to go back down?" Daniel asked quietly. "We could move the presentation to a conference room." "No, we do it here." They specifically requested the observation deck because Grant told them the views would be impressive. "If I back out now, it signals weakness." She released the door frame and took 3 careful steps onto the deck. "I just need a minute to adjust." Daniel watched her walk slowly toward the glass barrier, each step deliberate, her entire body radiating tension. When she reached the barrier, she gripped it with both hands and looked down at the city spread out 400 feet below. "Tell me about the engineering," she said, her voice tight. Daniel moved to stand beside her, close enough to catch her if needed, but not so close as to be obvious about it. The glass is 3/4-inch laminated safety glass with a tensile strength of 20,000 pounds per square inch. It's anchored to steel posts embedded in the deck structure with bolts rated for wind loads up to 100 miles per hour. The deck itself is reinforced concrete with a safety factor of 3, meaning it can hold 3 times the maximum rated occupancy load. Keep going. The building's sway at this height during high winds is approximately 6 inches, which feels like more but is well within design parameters. The glass barriers are designed to flex slightly with the building movement rather than remaining rigid, which actually makes them stronger. Every component up here has been tested beyond failure points to ensure redundancy. Victoria's breathing was starting to slow, becoming more controlled. What's the failure probability? For the barriers, less than 0.01% over the building's lifetime, assuming proper maintenance. For the deck structure, essentially 0 under any realistic load conditions. Those are good odds, Victoria said, but she didn't release her grip on the barrier. They're excellent odds. You're statistically safer up here than driving to work. Statistics don't account for the fact that falling from a car happens at 5 feet, and falling from here happens at 400. True. But probability of falling from here is several orders of magnitude lower than falling from a car accident. Daniel paused, then added quietly, "You don't have to stay up here. Nobody would think less of you for moving the presentation inside." "I would think less of me," Victoria replied. "I spent 10 years being terrified and hiding it. I'm done hiding." She released the barrier with obvious effort and turned to face the deck. "Let's set up. They'll be here in 15 minutes." The investors arrived precisely at 4 p.m., 12 people representing the capital that was funding Summit Arc and 3 future projects. They were dressed in expensive suits and carried themselves with the casual confidence of people accustomed to being the most important individuals in any room. Grant arrived with them, playing host, directing them to the seating area while the catering staff distributed drinks. Daniel recognized several faces from the board meetings. Margaret Chen was there, along with Charles Whitmore and Patricia Hoffman. The others were external investors he hadn't met, including a tall man in his 60s who seemed to be the group's informal leader. Victoria greeted them with practiced warmth, showing no sign of the terror Daniel knew she was managing. She directed everyone to their seats, waited for the conversation to settle, then moved to the presentation area with the city skyline as her backdrop. "Thank you all for joining us this afternoon," she began, her voice carrying clearly despite the wind. "We're here to discuss Summit Arc Tower and the recent structural enhancements we've implemented. Rather than viewing these modifications as corrections, I want you to understand them as what they actually are: a commitment to building the safest, most structurally advanced residential tower in the city." She pulled up the first slide on the portable screen they'd set up, showing seismic activity data for the region. This area experiences magnitude 6.0 or greater earthquakes approximately every 25 years. Most buildings are designed to survive these events with repairable damage. Summit Arc is being designed to survive them with 0 damage, maintaining full functionality even after major seismic events. The tall investor leaned forward. "That's an impressive claim. What makes it possible?" "Enhanced structural redundancy systems," Daniel said, stepping forward to stand beside Victoria. "We've implemented secondary reinforcement throughout the vertical support structure, reduced cross-bracing intervals to optimize load distribution, and added damping systems that absorb seismic energy more efficiently than standard designs. The result is a building that doesn't just meet code, it exceeds it by margins that most residential towers can't match." "At what cost?" another investor asked. $11 million in materials and schedule adjustments, Victoria answered directly, which represents approximately 3% of the total project budget. In exchange, we're delivering a building that will maintain its structural integrity and market value even after seismic events that would require costly repairs in competing properties. Margaret spoke up from the back row. "In other words, our building will be the safe choice when the next earthquake hits. That's marketable." "Exactly," Victoria confirmed. "We're not just building apartments. We're building the property that maintains its value when others don't, that attracts tenants who prioritize safety, that commands premium pricing because it delivers premium protection." Charles raised his hand. "I understand the market positioning, but I'm concerned about the precedent this sets. If we're redesigning buildings mid-construction every time an engineer has concerns, How do we maintain budget discipline on future projects? It was the question Grant had been waiting for. Daniel saw him lean forward slightly, ready to amplify the concern if the answer wasn't satisfactory. This wasn't a routine engineer concern, Victoria replied. This was a comprehensive structural analysis that identified specific vulnerabilities in a building of unprecedented height in a seismically active zone. The decision to implement modifications wasn't reactive uncertainty. It was proactive risk management based on data that emerged during construction. Data that your consultants didn't identify during the design phase? Another investor pressed. Data that required analysis at a level of detail beyond what standard consulting provides, Daniel clarified. The consultants confirmed the design met code, which it does. Our analysis went further, modeling long-term material performance under repeated stress cycles and identifying optimization opportunities that weren't part of the original scope. The tall investor studied Daniel with sharp intelligence. You're the engineer who raised the concerns originally? Yes, sir. And you're confident these modifications are necessary, not just conservative engineering. Daniel met his gaze directly. I'm confident that without these modifications, Summit Arc would experience significant structural damage during a major earthquake within its operational lifetime. With the modifications, it won't. That's not conservatism. That's competent long-term planning. How significant is significant? The investor asked. Potential for partial collapse in the upper floors, extensive damage requiring months of repairs and tenant evacuation, and liability exposure in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Those are engineering assessments, not hypotheticals. The wind picked up suddenly, strong enough to make the portable screen flutter and the glass barriers emit a low hum. Daniel saw Victoria's hands tighten on her presentation remote, saw her force herself to remain still instead of stepping away from the barrier behind her. Are we safe up here right now? Patricia asked, half joking but with an edge of genuine concern. Absolutely, Daniel said immediately. This deck is designed for wind loads twice what we're experiencing. The glass barriers are anchored to withstand hurricane-force winds. The building sway you might be feeling is normal and well within design parameters. How much sway? Someone asked. At this height, in current wind conditions, approximately 2 inches, during a major storm, possibly 6 inches. All completely normal and accounted for in the structural design. The tall investor stood up, walked to the glass barrier, and looked down at the city below. I've financed 17 high-rise projects in my career. Every single one of them had engineers who wanted to add safety systems that exceeded code. Most of the time I said no because the cost didn't justify the marginal benefit, but I've also lived through 2 building failures that destroyed investor confidence and resulted in class action lawsuits that bankrupted the development firms. He turned to face the group. 3% of budget to eliminate catastrophic risk exposure? That's not an expense. That's insurance, and it's insurance I'm willing to pay for. Margaret nodded. Agreed. The market advantage alone justifies the cost. Being able to market Summit Arc as earthquake-resistant gives us a competitive edge that's worth more than $11 million in premium pricing over the building's lifetime. The tide was turning. Daniel could feel it in the room, in the way other investors were nodding, in the way Grant's expression had shifted from confident to resigned. They were winning the narrative. But then the wind gusted again, stronger this time, and the portable screen toppled over with a crash that made everyone jump. One of the glass barriers hummed audibly under the pressure, and Daniel saw Victoria take an involuntary step backward, her face draining of color. She was losing it. The combination of height and wind and stress was overwhelming the control she'd been maintaining. Daniel saw her hands start to shake, saw her breathing become rapid and shallow. He stepped forward smoothly, positioning himself between Victoria and the investor's view. Let me address the structural response you're all feeling right now, he said, his voice carrying over the wind. When wind hits a building at this height, the structure responds by flexing slightly, absorbing and dissipating the energy rather than resisting it rigidly. That's intentional engineering. Rigid structures break, flexible structures bend and return to equilibrium. Behind him, he heard Victoria's breathing slow slightly as she focused on his words instead of her fear. The hum you're hearing from the glass barriers is the laminated layers vibrating at different frequencies, Daniel continued. It's acoustically notable but structurally irrelevant. The barriers are performing exactly as designed, flexing with the wind pressure and distributing the load across the anchor points. He was buying Victoria time to recover, giving her space to step back from the edge of panic. He kept talking, explaining the physics of wind load and structural response, demonstrating competence and calm while she steadied herself behind him. "The building we're constructing downtown," Daniel said, gesturing toward the construction site visible in the distance, "will respond to wind and seismic forces with the same engineering principles we're experiencing right here: controlled flexibility, strategic damping, and redundant safety systems that ensure the structure protects its occupants under any realistic stress conditions." Victoria's voice came from beside him, steadier now but still carrying an edge of tension. "What Daniel's explaining is why we chose to enhance the structural systems. Not because the original design would fail under normal conditions, but because normal conditions aren't the only conditions a building faces over 50 years of operation. We're engineering for the full range of realistic scenarios, not just the average ones." She'd recovered. Not completely. Daniel could see the effort it was taking her to stand there, but enough to function, enough to project the confidence the investors needed to see. The tall investor returned to his seat, apparently satisfied with both the engineering explanation and the composure of the team presenting it. "I have one final question. If another concern emerges during construction, another structural element that could be enhanced, another system that could be improved, are you going to halt construction again and ask for more budget?" Victoria answered without hesitation. "If we identify a legitimate safety concern that requires modification, yes, but we're not designing by committee or second-guessing every decision. We're following rigorous engineering protocols and making data-driven choices. The modifications we've implemented address the specific vulnerabilities that analysis identified. They're not the beginning of an endless revision process." "Good answer," the investor said. "Then I'm satisfied. Build the building the right way, even if it costs more and takes longer. Reputation matters more than short-term returns." The other investors nodded agreement, and Daniel felt the tension that had been carrying him through the presentation finally release. They'd done it. They'd convinced 12 wealthy, skeptical people that spending $11 million on invisible safety systems was not just necessary, but advantageous. The presentation concluded with drinks and casual conversation, investors mingling and asking follow-up questions while the sun started to descend toward the horizon. Grant circulated through the crowd, his expression professionally pleasant, but his eyes cold whenever they landed on Daniel or Victoria. Daniel found Victoria standing near the elevator, as far from the glass barriers as she could get while remaining on the deck. Her hands were still trembling slightly, but her face was composed. "You saved me up there," she said quietly. "When I started losing it, you stepped in without making it obvious. Thank you." "You would have recovered on your own," Daniel replied. "I just bought you time." "No, I wouldn't have. I was about 10 seconds from a full panic attack in front of 12 investors. You gave me something to focus on besides the fear, and that made all the difference." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You're good at this. The engineering, the presentation, the crisis management. You've been hiding these skills for 20 years. "I've been hiding myself for 20 years, Daniel corrected. "I'm still figuring out what happens when I stop." "What happens is you become someone Grant can't ignore or dismiss, and that makes you dangerous to him." Victoria glanced across the deck to where Grant was talking with Charles and Patricia. "He's going to come after you now. Not openly, he's too smart for that. But he'll be looking for mistakes, for anything he can use to prove you're not qualified for the position I gave you. Watch yourself." "I'm more worried about you," Daniel said. "That presentation took everything you had. How much longer can you keep facing this fear before it breaks you?" Victoria was quiet for a long moment, watching the sun paint the city in shades of amber and gold. "I don't know. But I know that every time I force myself to stand at these windows, to walk onto this deck, to be present in the spaces that terrify me, I'm proving that fear doesn't get to control my life. That competence matters more than comfort. That understanding the physics means I can trust the engineering even when every instinct screams danger." "That's not sustainable," Daniel said gently. "Neither is hiding from everything that scares you. We all choose which way we're going to break, from confronting too much or from avoiding too much. I'd rather break from courage than from cowardice." The investors began leaving, thanking Victoria and Daniel for the presentation, expressing confidence in the project and its enhanced structural systems. The tall investor stopped on his way to the elevator, looking directly at Daniel. "Your daughter should be proud of you," he said unexpectedly. "It takes courage to speak up when everyone else is staying silent. Don't lose that just because you've won this round." Daniel blinked, surprised. "How did you know I have a daughter?" The investor smiled slightly. "Margaret mentioned it. She does her research on people who make waves in firms she's invested in. Apparently you're a widower raising a 12-year-old and still finding time to fight for structural integrity. That's character worth preserving." He left before Daniel could respond, and Daniel was left wondering exactly how much the investors knew about him and whether that knowledge would work for or against him in the battles ahead. By the time the deck cleared, the sun was setting properly, painting the sky in dramatic reds and purples that made the city look like something from a dream. Daniel and Victoria stood alone on the observation deck, the wind softer now, the day's tension finally draining away. "I need to tell you something," Victoria said, still looking at the sunset. "The stadium collapse I mentioned in the board meeting, the one where people died because engineers stayed silent about safety concerns. I wasn't just junior staff who witnessed it. I was the structural engineer who raised the concerns and was told to be quiet, who chose career safety over speaking up, who lived with that guilt for 10 years and swore I'd never make that choice again." Daniel absorbed this, understanding suddenly why Victoria had backed him so completely, why she'd risked her position and reputation to support his analysis. "You didn't stay silent this time." "No, and it cost me everything back then. My job, my reputation, my confidence. The lead engineer who dismissed my concerns blamed me publicly when the collapse happened, claimed I'd been responsible for the design flaws I'd tried to warn him about. It took me years to rebuild my career, and I've spent every day since trying to prevent anyone else from going through what I went through." "Is that why you came to Titan Ridge, to build a culture where engineers can speak up?" "It's why I accepted the managing partner position. Margaret recruited me specifically because she wanted someone who would prioritize structural integrity over profit margins, who understood the real cost of cutting corners." Victoria finally turned from the sunset to look at Daniel. "When you sent that email at 1 a.m., raising concerns about Summit Arc, I knew exactly what it had cost you to send it. I knew the fear and doubt and conviction required to challenge approved decisions. And I knew that if I didn't back you, I'd be repeating the exact failure that destroyed me 10 years ago." "You're not the person who failed 10 years ago," Daniel said firmly. "You're the person who learned from it and made sure it wouldn't happen again. That's not the same thing. Tell that to the families of the people who died in that stadium collapse." "I can't. But I can tell you that the thousands of people who'll live in Summit Arc over the next 50 years, they'll be safe because you chose courage over career protection. That matters more than the mistake you made when you were too young to know better." Victoria's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I hope you're right. Because if we're wrong about these modifications, if we've spent $11 million and delayed the project for nothing, then I've ruined 2 careers on the basis of trauma-driven overcorrection rather than sound engineering judgment." "We're not wrong," Daniel said with absolute certainty. "The building needed the safety systems. You made the right call." They stood in silence for a while, watching the city lights begin to glow as darkness crept across the sky. Finally, Victoria moved toward the elevator, no longer trembling but moving with the exhaustion of someone who'd spent hours fighting their own biology. "Go home, Hayes," she said. "Spend the evening with your daughter. Tomorrow we start managing the actual construction modifications. And Grant's going to make every day as difficult as possible. Enjoy tonight while you can." Daniel rode the elevator down alone, thinking about Victoria's confession, about the weight of past failures and the courage required to risk failing again in pursuit of doing better. He thought about the investors who'd approved spending $11 million based on a presentation delivered by 2 people who were barely holding themselves together. He thought about how much of professional success was actually performance, projecting confidence while managing fear, displaying certainty while navigating doubt. His phone buzzed as he reached the parking garage. A message from an unknown number. "This is Grant. You won today. Congratulations. But remember that construction lasts months and gives me plenty of opportunities to demonstrate why the modifications were unnecessary. Sleep well." Daniel deleted the message without responding. Whatever game Grant wanted to play, it would have to wait until tomorrow. Tonight, he drove home to Lily, who met him at the door with homework questions and stories about school drama and absolute conviction that her father was capable of anything. They had dinner together, watched a nature documentary about deep-sea creatures, and talked about the pressure required to survive at ocean depths. "It's kind of amazing," Lily said as an anglerfish appeared on screen, "that things can exist in conditions that would crush everything else, like they evolved specifically to handle pressure that would destroy normal fish." "Adaptation under extreme conditions," Daniel agreed. "Biology's way of proving that hostile environments create specialized strength." "Do you think that works for people too? Like maybe the pressure makes you stronger instead of breaking you?" Daniel looked at his daughter, at this fierce, intelligent person who was asking questions that he was still trying to answer at 43. "I think it depends on whether you're designed for the pressure or just enduring it. If you choose the challenge, if you prepare for it and understand what it requires, then pressure creates strength. If you're just surviving forces you never wanted to face, it usually just breaks you slowly." "Which one are you?" Lily asked seriously. "I'm still figuring that out," Daniel admitted. "Ask me again in 6 months." She nodded, satisfied with the honest answer, and returned her attention to the fish that lived in darkness and survived through bioluminescence and predation and adaptations that seemed impossible until you understood them. Daniel watched the documentary but thought about buildings, about the invisible forces that shape structures and determined whether they stood or fell, about the courage required to acknowledge vulnerability and the engineering required to address it, about Victoria standing at windows she was terrified of, and Daniel speaking up when staying quiet would have been safer. About the building rising from the ground downtown, 70 stories of steel and glass and concrete that would protect thousands of lives if the engineering was right and destroy careers if it was wrong. The pressure was enormous, the stakes were absolute, and tomorrow the real work would begin. But tonight, he sat with his daughter and watched fish survive in impossible conditions, and felt grateful that some battles were worth fighting even when the outcome was uncertain. Because the alternative, staying invisible, staying silent, staying safe, wasn't actually safety at all. It was just a slower way of disappearing. The construction modifications began the following Monday with the systematic precision of controlled demolition followed by careful reconstruction. Daniel spent his days on site, watching as crews dismantled sections of the tower that had already been built and replaced them with the enhanced structural systems his analysis had demanded. Each day felt like an argument made in steel and concrete, a physical manifestation of the choice to prioritize safety over expedience. Grant was there too, always watching, always documenting, always finding small delays or minor cost overruns to highlight in his daily reports to the board. He never confronted Daniel directly, never made his opposition obvious, but his presence was a constant reminder that this battle wasn't over. It had simply moved from boardrooms to construction sites. 3 weeks into the modifications, a welding crew discovered a stress fracture in one of the original vertical support columns, exactly where Daniel's models had predicted material fatigue would begin. The foreman called Daniel over, pointing to the hairline crack that ran 18 inches along the steel beam. "This what you were worried about?" he asked. Daniel examined the fracture, his heart sinking even as his analysis was being validated. This is what would have propagated over 15 years until the column failed under seismic stress. "We caught it early." "Lucky we're doing the modifications then," the foreman said casually, already moving on to direct his crew. But Daniel stood there for a long moment, staring at the physical evidence that his worst fears had been justified. The building would have failed, people would have been hurt, and if he'd stayed quiet, if he'd trusted the process instead of trusting his analysis, that fracture would have remained hidden until catastrophe made it visible. He took photographs, documented the location and extent of the damage, and sent a detailed report to Victoria with copies to the board. Within an hour, Grant was on site, staring at the fractured column with an expression Daniel couldn't quite read. "One stress fracture doesn't validate an $11 million redesign," Grant said finally. "One stress fracture in the exact location the models predicted validates the entire methodology," Daniel countered. "This is proof of concept. The vulnerabilities were real. Or it's proof that normal inspection processes would have caught the problem before it became critical. We do quarterly structural assessments. This would have been identified and addressed. In 15 years? After how many other fractures had developed? After how much hidden damage had accumulated? Daniel kept his voice level, refusing to be drawn into anger. We're fixing this now while it's a single fracture in one column instead of systemic failure across multiple load-bearing elements. Grant walked away without responding, but Daniel saw him on his phone immediately afterward, no doubt reporting to board members who were already questioning the expense. The political war was continuing exactly as Victoria had predicted, Grant looking for any evidence that the modifications were unnecessary, Daniel having to justify every decision and every cost. But the work continued. The fractured column was replaced. The secondary reinforcement systems were installed. The cross-bracing intervals were reduced and strengthened. Every day the building became safer, more resilient, more capable of protecting the people who would eventually call it home. Lily noticed the change in her father during those months. He was busier than ever, leaving before she woke up and returning after dinner more nights than not. But when he was present, he was fully present in a way he hadn't been for years. Mrs. Patterson commented on it one evening when she came over to check on them. "Your father's different lately," she said to Lily, while Daniel was in the other room taking a work call. "More solid somehow. Like he's taking up space he wasn't claiming before." "He's fighting for something that matters," Lily replied with the simple clarity of a 12-year-old who understood more than adults gave her credit for. "Mom always said Dad was strongest when he had something to protect. I think he forgot that for a while after she died. And now he remembers? Now he has a building full of people to protect. And me. And himself, I think." Lily looked toward the room where her father's voice carried through the door, technical and confident. "He's not invisible anymore." The modifications took 4 months exactly, coming in under the projected timeline and within 2% of the estimated budget. The enhanced structural systems were in place, tested and verified by independent inspectors who confirmed that Summit Arc now exceeded code requirements by margins that were exceptional for residential construction. The board met to review the final costs and timeline impact. Daniel sat in the meeting this time, no longer the invisible engineer presenting concerns, but the senior structural engineer reporting on successfully completed enhancements. The dynamic had shifted subtly but significantly. Victoria presented first, showing the completed modifications and their impact on the building's structural performance. Summit Arc is now engineered to withstand seismic events up to magnitude 7.0 with minimal damage. We've enhanced the building's long-term durability, reduced maintenance requirements for critical systems, and created a marketable competitive advantage that justifies premium pricing. Margaret spoke up from her usual position. "The fractured column that was discovered during modifications, that's been addressed?" "Completely replaced and reinforced," Daniel confirmed, along with comprehensive inspection of all similar connection points throughout the structure. No additional fractures were found, which suggests we identified the vulnerability before it could propagate to other elements. Charles leaned forward, looking directly at Grant. "You opposed these modifications from the beginning. Do you still maintain they were unnecessary?" Grant's expression was carefully controlled. "I maintain that they exceeded what code required and what our consultants recommended. Whether they were necessary is a question that can only be answered by events that haven't occurred yet. We've spent $11 million preventing a theoretical failure. Time will tell if that was money well spent or money wasted on excessive caution." "Time already told us," Daniel said quietly. "The fracture we found was real, not theoretical. The failure pathway we modeled was developing exactly as predicted. We didn't prevent a theoretical problem. We prevented a real one that hadn't fully manifested yet." The distinction seemed to land with several board members. Patricia spoke up, her tone thoughtful. "So what you're saying is the modifications were vindicated by what you found during construction?" "I'm saying the analysis was accurate and the response was appropriate," Daniel replied. "We identified vulnerabilities, implemented solutions, and discovered physical evidence that validated the concerns. That's engineering working as it should, preventing problems before they become catastrophes." The board voted unanimously to accept the modifications as complete and to proceed with construction on the enhanced timeline. Grant abstained, which was as close to an admission of defeat as he was likely to give. The meeting adjourned with cautious optimism, the firm having survived a crisis that could have destroyed it. But Daniel knew the real test was still coming. Construction continued for another 14 months. the tower rising floor by floor until it dominated the downtown skyline exactly as the renderings had promised. Summit Arc became a landmark before it was even completed, its distinctive architecture and premium positioning attracting attention from architecture magazines and urban development forums. Victoria leveraged the enhanced structural systems and marketing materials, positioning the building as earthquake-resistant luxury living, and pre-sales exceeded projections by 30%. The building was topped out on a clear morning in late spring, the final steel beams signed by the construction crew and lifted into place while cameras documented the milestone. Daniel stood on the ground watching, thinking about how that beam would never be visible to the people who lived in the building, but it would hold them safely for generations. Invisible engineering for invisible protection. Exactly the kind of work he'd spent 20 years doing quietly. Except he wasn't quiet anymore. And people had noticed. 2 competing firms reached out with job offers, both offering senior engineering positions at salaries significantly higher than what Titan Ridge was paying. Daniel declined both, not because the offers weren't attractive, but because the work at Summit Arc felt unfinished. He'd fought for the building's safety. He wanted to see it succeed. Lily was starting high school that fall, transitioning from the quiet, determined 12-year-old to a confident young woman who'd inherited her mother's fierce intelligence and her father's methodical precision. She'd joined the robotics team, was taking advanced mathematics, and had announced her intention to study structural engineering in college. "Because of what you did with the tower?" Daniel had asked when she told him. "Because of what you taught me about standing up for what's right, even when it's expensive and difficult and makes people angry," she'd corrected. "The engineering is just how I'll apply that." The building opened in October, a full year after the modifications had been completed and exactly on the revised timeline Victoria had promised the board. The grand opening event was held in the building's lobby, a soaring 3-story space with windows that looked out over the city and up at the 70 floors rising above. Investors, board members, city officials, and press gathered to celebrate what was being called the safest residential tower in the region. Victoria gave the opening remarks, looking poised and confident in a way that only Daniel knew required medication and willpower and exposure therapy sessions twice a week. Summit Arc represents what's possible when we prioritize long-term value over short-term savings, when we invest in safety systems that residents will never see but will always benefit from, when we choose to build not just a code, but to the highest standards we can achieve. She introduced the design team, the construction managers, the consultants and contractors who'd brought the project to life. And then she did something that surprised everyone in the room. But this building would not stand the way it does today without one person who had the courage to question approved decisions, to challenge professional consensus, and to insist that meeting code wasn't the same as maximizing safety. Daniel Hayes, our senior structural engineer, identified critical vulnerabilities in the original design and fought to address them even when doing so was professionally risky and personally costly. This building is safe because he refused to stay silent. "Would you please join me, Daniel?" The room applauded as Daniel made his way to the front, feeling acutely uncomfortable with the attention, but understanding that this moment mattered. Victoria was publicly acknowledging what he'd done, creating a record that couldn't be erased or minimized. "I didn't do anything extraordinary," Daniel said when the applause faded. "I did what engineers are supposed to do: analyze structures, identify weaknesses, and recommend solutions. The extraordinary part was having a managing partner who listened when I raised concerns, who backed the analysis even when it was expensive, who prioritized structural integrity over convenience. Victoria Cole made this building safe by choosing courage over comfort. I just provided the calculations." It was generous and honest, and shifted credit in a way that made Victoria's eyes shine with something that might have been tears or might have been gratitude. They stood together at the front of the room, the managing partner who'd overcome her fear of heights to approve a 70-story tower, and the engineer who'd overcome his fear of visibility to demand it be built right. Grant was in the audience, applauding with everyone else, his expression professionally pleasant and privately cold. He'd lost this battle completely, and everyone in the room knew it. But Daniel also knew that corporate memories were long, and Grant's resentment wouldn't fade just because the building had opened successfully. The reception continued for hours, investors and officials touring the building and praising its design. Daniel found himself answering technical questions about the structural systems, explaining the enhanced safety features in language that emphasized protection rather than prevention. People listened with genuine interest, and he realized that somewhere in the last 18 months, he'd learned to translate engineering into narrative, to make safety systems compelling rather than invisible. As the event wound down, Margaret Chen approached him with a glass of wine and a knowing smile. "You've done well, Mr. Hayes, better than I expected when I first saw you present to the board." "Thank you. I had good support." "You had Victoria's support, which is different from good support. It's the kind of support that comes with strings attached, expectations of excellence and integrity that most people can't sustain." Margaret sipped her wine thoughtfully. "She sees herself in you, I think, or who she wishes she'd been 20 years ago, someone who speaks up before the crisis instead of carrying guilt afterward." "She told you about the stadium collapse?" "She tells everyone eventually. It's her origin story, the failure that defined everything that came after. Some people are shaped by their successes. Victoria was shaped by her failure, and she's spent a decade making sure it never happens again." Margaret looked around the lobby, at the soaring space and the people celebrating. "This building exists because she refused to repeat that failure. You should be proud of being part of that." "I'm just glad it's safe." "Safety is never just anything," Margaret said seriously. "Safety is the invisible gift that engineers give the world, protection that goes unnoticed until it's absent. This building will stand for 50 years, maybe more, and thousands of people will live here without ever knowing that they're safe because you insisted on it. That's legacy, Mr. Hayes. That's work that matters." She walked away before Daniel could respond, leaving him alone with the thought that maybe invisibility wasn't the failure he'd always imagined it to be. Maybe some of the most important work was invisible precisely because it succeeded, because buildings stood instead of falling, because people were safe instead of endangered, because engineers did their jobs so well that nobody noticed the protection they'd built into every beam and column and connection point. The months after the opening were quieter, the crisis management and political battles fading into routine project work. Daniel managed the building's final inspections and certification processes, coordinated with property management on maintenance protocols for the enhanced structural systems, and began consulting on other projects where developers wanted similar safety enhancements. His reputation had shifted from invisible engineer to structural integrity specialist, the person firms called when they wanted buildings that exceeded code or needed analysis of existing structures. The work was challenging and meaningful, and exactly what he'd spent 20 years preparing for without realizing it. Victoria was managing the firm's expansion into 3 new projects, leveraging Summit Ark's success to attract investors who wanted buildings with premium safety features. She'd become an advocate for enhanced structural standards in the industry, speaking at conferences and writing articles about the business case for exceeding code requirements. She still medicated for heights and still practiced exposure therapy, but she'd stopped hiding her fear and started acknowledging it as something she managed rather than something that controlled her. Grant remained at the firm, still in his role as senior partner, but his influence had diminished noticeably. The board had seen him oppose modifications that were later vindicated, had watched him prioritize budget over safety, and had drawn conclusions about his judgment. He wasn't fired or demoted. Corporate politics rarely worked that directly. But he was quietly moved to projects where his commercial instincts were valuable, but his engineering opinions were less critical. He and Daniel maintained professional courtesy, but nothing more. They passed in hallways without speaking, attended meetings without interacting, and existed in the same firm while occupying completely different positions within its power structure. Daniel had won, but the victory felt less satisfying than he'd expected. Grant's resentment was a permanent fixture now, a reminder that standing up for principles created enemies as surely as it created respect. 18 months after Summit Ark's opening, Daniel was working late in his office when the building began to shake. Not violently, not catastrophically, but with the unmistakable rolling motion of an earthquake. His computer monitor swayed on its stand. Coffee sloshed in his cup. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered and hummed. He stood frozen, heart pounding, as the shaking continued for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds. Then it stopped, leaving behind the peculiar silence that follows seismic events, when everyone is simultaneously assessing damage and hoping it's over. Daniel's phone exploded with notifications. Emergency alerts, news updates, Messages from colleagues asking if everyone was okay. And then, after a few seconds of frantic scrolling, the information that made his blood run cold. Magnitude 6.7. Earthquake. Epicenter 40 miles outside the city. Buildings downtown reporting damage, evacuations in progress, emergency services responding to multiple structural failures. He grabbed his jacket and ran for the elevator, his mind racing through calculations about Summit Arc, about the enhanced structural systems they'd installed, about whether 18 months was long enough for those systems to prove their worth or fail spectacularly. The elevator descended too slowly, and when he finally burst out into the parking garage, he found Victoria already there, standing next to her car with her phone pressed to her ear. "I'm heading to Summit Arc now," she was saying. "Get the structural assessment team mobilized. I want eyes on every critical system within the hour." She saw Daniel and ended the call. "You heard? 6.7 magnitude. How bad is the damage downtown?" 3 buildings evacuated so far. 1 office tower reporting cracked support columns. The mayor's calling it a major seismic event. She met his eyes, and he saw his own fear reflected there. "Summit Arc? We need to see it." They drove together in Victoria's car, speeding through streets that were chaotic with emergency vehicles and confused traffic. The radio provided updates in clipped professional tones, damage assessments, evacuation orders, injuries reported but no fatalities yet. The earthquake had been significant but not catastrophic, the kind of event the city experienced every 20 to 30 years, exactly as Daniel's analysis had predicted. Summit Arc came into view as they turned onto the downtown corridor, 70 stories of glass and steel rising against the evening sky, its windows still lit, its structure still standing. Victoria pulled into the building's emergency access area, and they ran toward the entrance where property management staff were already gathering. "Anyone injured?" Victoria asked immediately. "Minor injuries from falling objects," the building manager reported. "No structural casualties. Elevators are offline as a precaution. We're conducting floor-by-floor assessments now." "I need access to the structural monitoring systems," Daniel said. They took the emergency stairs to the mechanical floor, climbing 20 flights with the adrenaline that comes from needing to know whether everything they'd fought for had worked. The monitoring room was staffed with the building's engineers, all of them staring at screens that showed real-time data from sensors throughout the structure. Daniel scanned the readouts with practice speed: vertical displacement measurements, horizontal sway data, stress readings from critical connection points, seismic damping system performance. Everything was recording data from the earthquake, creating a comprehensive picture of how the building had responded to the stress. "Maximum sway was 8 inches at the 70th floor," one of the engineers reported. "Well within design parameters. Seismic dampers absorbed approximately 60% of the horizontal energy. Stress concentrations at critical joints remained below yield thresholds throughout the event." Daniel pulled up the data from the specific connection points where they'd installed the secondary reinforcement systems, the ones Grant had argued were unnecessary. The sensors showed elevated stress during the earthquake, but nowhere near the levels that would indicate damage or material fatigue. The enhanced systems had distributed the load exactly as designed, preventing the concentration of forces that would have created failure points. "Any structural damage at all?" Victoria asked. "Cosmetic damage in 3 retail spaces, cracked drywall, and broken display fixtures. 1 broken window on the 42nd floor from an air pressure differential. No structural damage detected anywhere in the load-bearing systems." Victoria sat down heavily in one of the monitoring stations, the relief so intense it was almost physical. It worked. The modifications worked. "The modifications performed exactly as designed," Daniel corrected, but he felt the same overwhelming relief. They'd been right. The enhanced structural systems had protected the building and everyone in it. The $11 million and 4 months of delays and professional battles had been worth every penny and every moment. His phone buzzed. A message from Margaret Chen. "Watching news coverage of the earthquake. How is Summit Arc?" Daniel typed back. "No structural damage. Building performed flawlessly. Enhanced systems validated." Her response came immediately. "Worth every dollar we spent. Well done." Well, over the next hour, data came in from other buildings downtown. The office tower that had reported cracked support columns was being evacuated, and would require extensive repairs before reoccupancy. A residential building constructed 5 years earlier with minimal seismic protection had experienced significant damage to its parking structure. 2 older buildings were being yellow-tagged pending structural assessment, and Summit Ark stood undamaged, its residents shaken but safe, its structural systems having performed exactly as the enhanced design had promised. The news picked up the story quickly. By the next morning, Summit Ark was being featured in earthquake coverage as an example of superior seismic engineering, the building that had sustained minimal damage while others failed. Interviews with residents praised the building's stability during the earthquake. Engineering publications requested technical details about the structural enhancements. And investors who'd initially questioned the $11 million modification cost were suddenly calling to discuss implementing similar systems in other projects. Victoria scheduled a press conference for that afternoon, standing in Summit Ark's lobby with Daniel beside her and a crowd of journalists asking questions about earthquake resistance and structural engineering and what made the building perform so well. The answer is straightforward, Victoria said. We chose to exceed code requirements. We invested in structural systems that provided redundancy and safety margins beyond what was strictly necessary. We listened when our engineers identified vulnerabilities, and we addressed them even when doing so was expensive. This building is safe because we prioritized long-term protection over short-term savings. A journalist asked Daniel directly, "How did you know the building needed enhanced structural systems?" "Seismic analysis and material modeling," Daniel replied. "We examined how the building would respond to realistic earthquake scenarios over its operational lifetime. The original design met code, but code is minimum standard. We wanted optimal standard, so we added secondary reinforcement, improved load distribution, and installed damping systems that absorbed energy instead of transmitting it through the structure. Yesterday's earthquake proved that those enhancements work." Was there opposition to spending the money on these modifications? Daniel glanced at Victoria, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "There was debate about cost versus benefit," he said carefully. "Some people believed the original design was sufficient. Others believed we should exceed minimum standards. The board ultimately chose to invest in maximum safety. Yesterday's earthquake vindicated that choice." The press conference continued for another 30 minutes, but the narrative was already set. Summit Ark was the success story of the earthquake, the building that demonstrated what proper engineering and adequate investment could achieve. And Daniel and Victoria were being positioned as the team that had made it happen, the engineer who'd identified the need, and the managing partner who'd supported the solution. Grant watched the press conference from his office, his expression unreadable. He'd opposed the modifications from the beginning, had called them unnecessary and expensive, had fought against the decision at every level, and now the earthquake had proved him wrong in the most public way possible. That evening, he submitted his resignation from Titan Ridge, citing new opportunities and career transitions. Nobody believed the official explanation. Everyone understood he was leaving because his judgment had been publicly discredited and his position within the firm had become untenable. Daniel felt no satisfaction in Grant's departure, only a weary recognition that professional battles left casualties even when the right side won. Grant had been wrong about the modifications, but he'd been excellent at commercial development and project management. The firm was losing talent because pride in politics had made it impossible for someone to acknowledge being wrong and move forward. Victoria accepted the resignation without trying to convince Grant to stay. "I wish it hadn't come to this," she told Daniel when they discussed it later. "But I also can't have senior partners who prioritize budget over safety. The earthquake proved that our approach works. Grant couldn't accept that, so he had to leave." "Do you think he'll ever admit he was wrong?" "I think he'll spend the rest of his career telling a different story about what happened here, one where he was the pragmatist fighting against excessive caution, where the earthquake was a statistical anomaly that happened to coincide with our expensive modifications, where the real lesson is about managing costs rather than maximizing safety." Victoria shrugged. "People believe the narratives that protect their self-image. Grant will believe he was right even though the evidence says otherwise. That's not how engineering works." "No, but it's how people work, and firms are made of people, not equations." The months following the earthquake transformed both Titan Ridge and Daniel's career. The firm became known for structural excellence, attracting projects from clients who wanted buildings engineered to the same standards as Summit Arc. Victoria was promoted to CEO, bringing her safety-first philosophy to the entire organization. And Daniel became managing partner of engineering, leading a team of structural specialists who analyzed projects for vulnerability and designed solutions that exceeded code. He was no longer the invisible engineer. He was the face of structural integrity, the professional whose analysis had prevented catastrophic failure, the example of what happened when engineers had the courage to speak up, and leaders had the wisdom to listen. Lily graduated from high school with honors, acceptance letters from 6 universities, and absolute certainty that she was going to study structural engineering and continue her father's work of making buildings safe. She'd grown into exactly the kind of person her mother had dreamed she'd become, brilliant and principled and uncompromising about doing what was right even when it was difficult. "I'm proud of you, Lilybug," Daniel said at her graduation party, holding his daughter close while Mrs. Patterson took photos and friends congratulated her on her achievements. "I'm proud of you too, Dad," she replied. "You taught me that invisible work matters, that standing up for what's right is worth the cost, and that the best legacy is the one people never see because it succeeds. Summit Arc still stands because you wouldn't stay quiet. That's the kind of engineer I want to be." 3 years after the earthquake, Daniel stood in Summit Arc's lobby on the anniversary of the building's opening, looking up at the 70 floors rising above him. The building was fully occupied now, home to 800 residential units and dozens of retail businesses. Thousands of people lived and worked here, protected by structural systems most of them would never know existed. Victoria found him standing there, following his gaze upward. "Thinking about what could have been?" "Thinking about what is," Daniel replied. "A building that stood when others didn't. People who were safe when they could have been hurt. Work that mattered even though it's invisible." "It's not invisible anymore. The industry knows what you did here. The industry knows about the modifications, but the residents here, they don't think about the secondary reinforcement or the cross-bracing intervals or the seismic damping systems. They just live their lives, trusting that the building will protect them. That's the success. The invisibility is the point." Victoria smiled, understanding. "You've come full way from the engineer who sent me an email at 1 a.m. because he couldn't sleep knowing the building was unsafe. I haven't come full circle. I've just learned that being visible isn't the same as being seen, and being invisible isn't the same as being insignificant. Some of the most important work is the work nobody notices because it succeeds completely." They stood in comfortable silence, 2 people who'd fought for a building's safety and one who'd faced their fears and transformed their careers, who'd learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Summit Arc rose above them, 70 stories of glass and steel and concrete, engineered to stand for generations. The building was Daniel's legacy, though his name appeared nowhere on it. The structure was Victoria's triumph, though she still medicated for heights and still struggled with the fear she'd been managing for years. But the building stood, and would continue standing long after both of them were gone, protecting people who would never know the battles that had been fought to make their safety possible. Daniel thought about his wife, about the promise he'd made to never teach their daughter to make herself smaller. He'd kept that promise, though it had taken him years to understand what it really meant. Being small wasn't about physical presence or professional visibility. It was about letting fear dictate choices, about choosing safety over significance, about making yourself invisible because being seen felt too dangerous. He wasn't small anymore. Neither was Victoria. Neither was Lily, who was learning that principles mattered more than popularity, and that standing firm was worth the price of standing alone. The sun set over the city, painting Summit Arc in shades of gold and amber, and Daniel felt a profound gratitude for the crisis that had forced him to become visible, for the managing partner who'd backed his analysis when doing so risked everything, for the building that stood as proof that doing the right thing mattered even when it was expensive and difficult and made people angry. He'd spent 20 years being the invisible engineer, making buildings stand while louder voices claimed credit. And then he'd spent 3 years being visible, fighting for a building's safety, and learning that visibility came with costs and complications and enemies who didn't forget. But he'd also learned that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the cost, that legacy was measured in lives protected rather than recognition earned, and that the most important work was often the work that succeeded so completely it became invisible. Summit Ark would stand for generations. The people who lived there would be safe. And Daniel Hayes, the quiet engineer who'd refused to stay quiet when it mattered most, would know that he'd built something that would outlast him. That was enough. That was everything. He took one last look at the building rising against the darkening sky, then walked out into the evening with Victoria beside him. Two people who'd learned that courage was a choice you made every day, that fear was something you managed rather than conquered, and that the greatest achievement was work so good it became invisible because it succeeded completely. The building stood. The people were safe. The work was done. And that invisible success was the greatest triumph of all.